please stay awake and alert, and maybe you have some questions as well, but that we can integrate into the session. Just a quick word of introduction. My name is Ines Nastalia. I work for S&P Global as a maritime data analyst, and I'm here with Antonis Mikael, who's the technical director of the International Association of Ports and Harbors World Port Sustainability Program, Gordon Wilmsmeyer, who works for Kuhne Professional, who's the Kuhne Professional Chair in Logistics at the Universidad de los Andes and the School of Management in Colombia, Michael Lind, who's a professor of maritime informatics at Chalmers and Research Institute of Sweden, but who asked me to be introduced as innovator. So we're looking forward to your innovative input. And lastly, we have Sam Cho, who's the commissioner at the Port of Seattle in the States. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining me. And to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about, we want to talk about how ports can add to decarbonization, to make port operations more sustainable, and to contribute to the energy transition, basically. And we're going to hear from the gentlemen how they think that can be achieved. Before that, I thought to just give you a bit of context, obviously because we're going to talk about ports being energy hubs as well, ports being the facilitator to distribute alternative fuels. So I've kind of gone into in my day job, I work within S&P in the ships and services team, which is responsible for handing out IMO numbers. There's a mandate we have by the IMO, which means that we have an overview of new builds coming into place as well, because you come to us and register your ship, so you get an IMO number. So I've just kind of looked into our database, and I'm just going to, again, as I said, throw a few numbers at you in terms of what propulsion future ships will run on. Most of them, the majority, will still run on very low sulfur fuel, 2/3, basically. 14% on LNG, but you kind of have to see that half of them actually, they are LNG carriers. They obviously then also run on their own fuel, so they kind of take that with a pinch of salt. But there's also a nice mix of tankers, container ships, bulkers, and car carriers that will run on LNG. Then we have quite a big gap, and then we got 2%, or around 140 vessels that will run on methanol, where container ships lead the table. Then we have 11 on ammonia and 23 on batteries, but those are, of course, ferries running on a schedule, basically, where they know they can recharge. And then I think an interesting fact that, in maritime we often, talk about money, of course. So our S&P Global Commodity Insights team assessed that the bunker price for methanol in February was $18, and compared to $15 for 0.5 sulfur marine fuel, which obviously is the prevalent bunker. So let's see how that develops in future. That might add to how the demand is shaping up. Then, and another caveat, obviously, when we talk about LNG, a lot of those ships obviously will have hybrid capability. So also, again, take that into consideration. These numbers I've given you are in the context of currently we have 140,000 vessels in service. So when I say we have 11 who will run on ammonia, that is obviously quite a small number. But we are getting a clearer picture of what the kind of the choices of the future in terms of fuel, with methanol for containers, and then ammonia and hydrogen probably more for transport and shorter journeys. So yeah, that was just my kind of short introduction. So you've gone through the numbers, well done. Now we're going to go get through the presentations, and then we're also going to have a discussion afterwards. So hopefully you'll be rewarded. Antonis, you're going to go first. You ready to go?
So, hello and a very good afternoon from my side as well. It's really a great pleasure to be here to address you as on behalf of the International Association of Ports and Harbors, the global alliance of ports worldwide. We do represent 180 ports globally, and our main role, of course, is representing their interests vis-a-vis all the United Nations agencies and the International Maritime Organization, very relevant to the discussion we're going to be having today, of course. And it's a great pleasure, of course, to talk to you about our efforts and our initiatives as World Ports community on the decarbonization. I'm going to touch base a bit, first of all, what we do as ports to facilitate the decarbonization of shipping. We've heard some numbers from Ines now. It is clear that the future will be a multi-fuel environment in ports where we'll have to be providing those fuels for shipping, but also overall ports have a role to play in the whole supply chain of those fuels from sites of production to sites of consumption of those fuels as well. So without further delay, first of all, when it comes to the role of ports in the decarbonization of maritime transport, this is pretty well defined by the so-called IMO Ports Resolution that was adopted and updated then by MEPC 74, I think it was adopted first time, and then updated by MEPC 79 a couple of years back. And that resolution, it's all about the voluntary cooperation between ports and shipping on assisting, though, the decarbonization of shipping. And it identifies some key areas where ports can have a positive contribution, including the provision of onshore power supply from renewable sources, of course, the provision of incentives to best performing vessels, port call optimization and just-in-time arrival related initiatives. What's the role of port on enabling port call optimization and just-in-time arrivals? And also, of course, and most important, arguably, to enable the whole decarbonization by 2050 that we're envisaging, what is the role of ports in ensuring the safe and efficient bunkering of those new forthcoming fuels in ports? In the last edition of the Ports Resolution, two extra key areas of potential interventions were included, and that is, on the one hand, route-based actions, where it was made reference to it at large green corridors, and the second one, how ports can function as clean energy hubs, and I'll come into that. It's a pleasure for me to report is that at the level of IAPH and the global port community overall, we have concrete initiatives that address all these areas. And in fact, we go back to IMO and we pioneered the adoption of the Ports Resolution together with the governance of Canada back in 2019, 2020. And then we go back to present progress reports on all those initiatives and how do we deal with those areas and how ports are advancing in tackling those areas and into facilitating the decarbonization of shipping. I'm not going to go together today in this short amount of time now through every single one of those initiatives, but still I think it's worth noticing some of the big developments out there. When it comes, for instance, to the provision of port incentives, our environmental SIP index, it's really since 2011, the standard index globally that evaluates the performance of vessels, attributes a score to vessels, and then 74 ports around the world come back and provide incentives in the form of reduced port fees, for instance, to vessels that demonstrate outstanding performance. 6,500 commercial vessels are enrolled to the system, clearly a success story, and clearly the standard port incentive scheme applied worldwide. Currently, we're building a new ESI to be launched fully in 2026. We are adjusting our baselines, we are becoming more ambitious, and also we're introducing a new comprehensive greenhouse gas emission module and an innovation module that will be able to reward vessels that invest on innovative technologies on board to improve their performance overall. Then when it comes to the bunkering of the new fuels in ports, one very important work stream in IPH is the work of our Clean Marine Fuels Working Group that has developed over time, and again it's active for 10 years, a safety framework and a safety toolkit for ports to use. We started this work 10 years ago, as I said, with liquefied natural gas, and over the years, and especially in the last 4 or 5 years, we are now using the previous work as a blueprint to produce this whole safety framework and safety toolkit for methanol, for hydrogen, for ammonia, and also for electrification. And as you can see in the slide as well, we're looking safety in an holistic way, including both the operational safety, when we develop bunkering checklists for the new fuels that ports are using around the world, to system safety, how we can audit, for instance, bunker fuel operators that are taking bunkering operations in our ports, and spatial allocation as well. Where would an ammonia bunkering take place in a port? What are the risk perimeters to be taken into account? What type of safety considerations? So a very important piece of work as well. Moving further, not only to safety, but also taking considerations of infrastructure, of fuel availability, of governance into account, and together with our colleagues in the World Ports Climate Action Program, we are developing, and we have developed, and we're bringing it to the next level, the Port Readiness Level for Marine Fuels Assessment Tool. This is an identification of 9 port readiness levels that has been done by the port community itself, and it is already there. The idea is that ports can assess then their port readiness level using a common methodology and standard that we develop together. They can assess the current readiness level against each of the fuels. They can assess their future level, if you like, or their level of ambitions for the years to come and visualize that. We are talking of PRL levels here in 3 areas as well, in 3 scopes. The one is how ready ports are to do bunkering operators. The second level is how ready ports are to accommodate vessels that are visiting and are propelled by those new fuels. And the third level, what is also the readiness level of ports to accommodate vessels that are carrying those fuels as cargo. Together with our colleagues at WPICAP and in Mission Innovation, with their kind assistance, we are developing the first digital version of the PRLMF tool that will be launched during our World Ports Conference in Hamburg coming October. Last but definitely not least of the initiatives I wanted to highlight to you is the Clean Energy Ministerial SEM Hub initiative, that it was done together and we started it together with our colleagues in the International Chamber of Shipping and with the full support of IPH, of course. And that goes beyond the use of the new fuels in the maritime transport. It goes beyond, it goes really to the role of ports and ships into transporting those fuels from places of production, largely in the global south, to global places of consumption of those fuels, and how we can work together, governments, industry, in an unprecedented getting together and creating those clean energy marine hubs around the globe of ports that will be also playing that crucial role there. On behalf of the Clean Energy Ministerial, there are 7 countries that are leading currently the SEM Hubs initiative. You can see them on the screen: Brazil, Canada, Greece, Norway, Panama, UAE, and Uruguay. And there are more that are expressing an interest as we speak and will be joining the initiative. So again, we're looking forward to see that developing, and it's a very ambitious one in the year to come. With that, Ines, I think I'm going to stop it there and as an introductory, and thank you very much, and very much looking forward to our debate afterwards. Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you, Antonis. Michael, do you want to go straight in and tell us a bit more about your research and your innovation making?
It's totally dangerous to say something before the session. So, my name is Michael Lind, and I have a T-shirt at home. It says, "I love ports." And I got it from my colleagues when we were trying to introduce port collaborative decision-making into the maritime sector. It was inspired from the aviation sector, where we already back in 2013 thought that we cannot do digitalization without collaboration, and collaboration cannot be pursued without digitalization. I remember the time when I was in Port of Valencia, together with our team from RISE, and we said that as the Port Authority, how about introducing this standard? That sounds like a great idea, but you need to check with our clients. Okay, so we went to Maersk. We thought that that was a good client. How about introducing this standard for port call messaging? And they said, oh, it's a great idea, but you need to check with our client. So I'm a Swede, so I thought that who is a good client? So I went to IKEA. I asked IKEA, what do you think about enhancing the predictability of port calls so that you know what's going on? And they answered, that would be a fantastic idea. Please do that. So I went back to Maersk, and Maersk said, it's a great idea, but Michael, we do not really have the resources at the moment. So, but please, I would really love to have your contact name to IKEA. That's how we drive innovation in this sector. It takes a little bit of time, and when trying to introduce these type of things in the port environment, I'm often challenged in different ways. So I think that we should give a lot of credits to ports in 2 different ways. I mean, it's it's right that IMO has a strong say when it comes to ports, at least 40 centimeters into the quay. There's so many legislations that ports need to consider in different ways, and for us, a port is an intermodal hub, meaning that you are catering for actually the transshipment within the same and between different modes of transports. Also, ports are in the middle of the whole decarbonization effort, where different value chains need to meet each other, such as the marine fuel value chain, the shipbuilding value chain, and also the maritime operational value chain, and they are in the middle. So what we did was that we developed a concept in Sweden. We gathered 52 ports in a community-driven approach to settle a concept for sustainable ports as transport nodes, energy node, with energy node capabilities and digital node capabilities. Just to set the scene a little bit, I got this image developed for me, and that is covering the crude oil and LNG vessels at the moment that has been moved from late 23 and up to April 24. And the green dots are LNG vessels, and the black dots are the crude oil vessels. And the maritime sector stands for 43% of all the transport made by maritime is related to transporting energy around the world. Interestingly, after the Rocket Festival in Suez, we do have a situation where the CO2 emission is actually booming again. It's never been so high as it is now, and that's very unfortunate. And also, if you look into the order stock of the vessels, you see that we do not have or we do not really have the plans yet for how we should handle this situation. So, but interestingly, you saw here that there are certain regions in the world, apparently, that is more LNG intense than other regions. So what we did in this concept as a result of a four-year endeavor, we co-crafted this vision of a sustainable port and a concept of a sustainable port. First of all, as a transport and logistic node, we should never forget that. And I think it's very important also in this debate that ports are there for managing goods and passengers somewhat. Of course, they have a role in the energy systems as well. We want things to happen in the port with as much predictability as possible. And I'm still traveling around and meeting port or harbor masters and the CEOs of ports, and I wonder, can I book a seat in your port? And normally the answer is, we serve you as you come, which is not really satisfying for the clients of the whole ecosystem. And we are running now an initiative where we went out and asked shippers, it's called the Virtual Watchtower Initiative, and said, what do you want from the transport ecosystem? And they just said, we want more transparency, we want somebody that can handle all the disruptions that occur during the transport. And the thing is that the port is the place where the items that are being transported are handled on a single unit basis. You cannot tell a big MSC or Maersk vessel to go to another port because there are so many shippers on board and so many interests on board these 24, 25, 26,000 TEU ships. They are energy and digital information nodes, meaning that they would supply energy and also, of course, cater for distribution of the energy to other parts of the ecosystem. It needs to acknowledge not just the window to the sea, it needs to acknowledge the window to different means of transport. They are consumers and suppliers of sustainable energy for the sustainable transport system and also an enabler of the transitions, why we are also being on stage here today. When it comes to ports as energy nodes, we provided the Swedish ports developed a maturity model saying that, okay, we need to distinguish between what we are in control over, meaning that we are most often in control over whether we should have that machine or that machine or that machine being operating inside the port. And that was what we coined here as level 2, so we need to do that sustainable. Level 3 was about catering for the needs of the visitors and not just then the ships. I mean, we have the same thing about trucks coming into the port, and they may actually need to charge the trucks. And then the trains is, of course, very sustainable, at least if you run on electricity trains. And then the fourth level is to be part of the ecosystem. And everything this is driven from the fact that you need to be taking a strategic stance on where you want to go, which we coined on level 1, and encouraging ports to actually develop an energy strategy. So, concludingly, I say that ports play an essential role for the production, storage, and provision of sustainable alternative fuels to visitors. That's a key aspect. Ports would benefit from moving to the forefront of decarbonization. I think that if you go and ask whichever major port, Hamburg, Singapore, Rotterdam, etc., you would hear that they would supply any type of fuel that the shipping industry wants. But that is a problem, of course, when you are talking about smaller ports. And I mean, now when we are rounding Africa, there must be a great opportunity for many different African ports to also provide that energy. But I doubt that they will have the infrastructure to invest in all means of or all fuel carriers. The group of actors that are engaged in port operations is and has always been a conglomerate of actors that are grouped in the port ecosystem. And what is happening now when we are bringing the energy node capabilities into the equation as well, that cluster of actors is expanded, which requires new collaborative models. And also, at the last point, is that we need to have more cross-value chain collaboration. Some people investigate how much does the maritime sector need in terms of sustainable energy and how much is that in relation to other sectors. And we cannot cater for example, if a big cruise vessel comes into Malmö port, southern Sweden, there will be a challenge when we connect that to the shore power for the citizens in the city. So by saying that, 1, I love ports. 2, I believe very much in collaborative innovation, and we need to put research into action. Thanks you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very good overview. I think that leaves us a good room to then continue the discussion, basically. But before that, Gordon, if you want to come and talk a bit about your work that you're doing in South Central and South America.
Okay. Good afternoon. Hello. Okay. All right. Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what our work is on working with ports and preparing them and bringing the action to the ground in order to reach what our goal is. And the big question that we have is, in theory, this one. Why are we here? Why are we here? Because we have a goal, right? 2050, zero emissions. And it's a challenge. And somehow, I've been participating in this type of meetings for the last 2 decades. And we talk about models, plans, and where are the numbers? Can anybody show me numbers, what we have done or what we have not done? Where is the gap? So one of the issues is that we're facing a Minsky moment. We still believe it's going to go back to the times that we had in the 19th and in the 2000s, and it's going to be growth, continuous growth, and steady development. Unfortunately, the bad news is it's probably not going to be that way. And so the question is, how do we really change our behavior in order to deal different with things? And we also have to change our behavior in order to reach this goal that we have, because we cannot continue like we did before. So why do we then want to measure energy consumption and emissions in port? And I focus here on energy consumption and emissions. Well, first, it's about competitiveness. Every liter of fuel you spend in your port that is not spent efficiently is a cost for your operation. That is not only about being sustainable. This is about being competitiveness. And also by choosing the type of fuel you use in your port for your port operation, it's about competitiveness because there's a cost involved to this. This also means if I don't sell the right fuels or operate with the right vehicles or equipment on these fuels, I'm also increasing my risk because my risk is going to increase in that port because I'm going to be more exposed to climate change. So I mentioned the economic impact, but also about the image, because my customers might want to have a clean product. And as a port, I'm part of that supply chain or that value chain, and I need to provide a clean product. And that should be zero emissions, or at least close to it, or very low emissions. And my client in Sweden, even Michael, when he drinks his cup of coffee from Colombia, he might want to know what was the carbon footprint of this product. And I, as a port, would have to inform that. So in this sense, we have to differentiate. It's about what is happening in the port operations. How can we decarbonize our port operations? That is one part. This is what I'm going to talk about primarily here. Then it's about how can we facilitate the decarbonization in the shipping industry, and Michael and Antonis mentioned that. And the third part is how can the ports act in the energy transition in importing and exporting fuels and creating these multi-fuel hubs in a sustainable way, which is a huge transition of the infrastructure but also of the transport modes and the industry related to that. Now the question here is we work with the World Bank on the new port reform toolkit, which is going to be published later this year, and we say, okay, if we develop an effort matrix about the impact of mitigation measures in ports, what are quick wins, what are priority projects, what are high-cost projects, what are hidden traps? And we found 3 dimensions. One is cost and effort that we need to bring this project forward. The other one is about emission reduction impact. And the third one is the time to impact. And what I marked here in green, these are all measures we can implement that have to do with energy consumption and thus with emissions in our ports. So there's a huge set of opportunities that we can actually develop, some in a short time, some in a medium time and long term. But even the long-term measures we have to start now if we want to really reach the targets. Now I'm going to give you some more examples, concrete examples on what we do. So first of all, we have some measures available in order to measure energy consumption emission. We started work with, when I was in ECLAC in Chile in 2014, okay, what was the energy consumption in ports in Latin America? And we, with this, contributed also to the Global Logistics Emissions Council framework, which was now published in its 3rd version in 2023. And since March last year, we have an ISO standard, 14083, which gives us a clear structure how to calculate the emissions and under which principles we can do that. So we do not have to reinvent the wheel. There's an idea how to do it, and we can drive it forward. So there's no secret about it. So I'm going to come back. Where are the numbers? If I'm going to ask the Port Authority of Barbados, what is the energy consumption in your port? Maybe I get an answer, maybe not. If I ask the Swedish port, I probably get an answer, but I probably don't get a benchmark how good they really are. So we have to then extend what we measure within the ports in terms of these other indicators, water, social, waste, energy, emissions, and we started to do that. We developed a methodology and worked together with the Chilean and the Colombian government in order to analyze at the terminal level what are the energy consumptions. With this we estimate emissions, considering the ISO 14083. Now, to give you some examples, we can now benchmark terminals in Colombia and in Chile. What type of energy they use, how much they use, what is the energy share, and also we understand what is the dynamics of it. You can see Chile very nicely. Chile has an export season of fruit. It will put stress on my energy system. And why is this important? That's important because the energy sector should know when these things are happening. They should be prepared for that. They need to provide the capacity. It's not only about the port. It's connecting with the other stakeholders, and here the energy stakeholders, that they are actually have that electricity, hopefully renewable, available at that moment when I need it in a port. And so I will have my seasons or will not have seasons, but I need to understand what is this demand. Michael mentioned in Sweden the lights turn off in a small village if you plug in a ship. Well, that's going to happen in Cartagena as well. That's going to happen in Panama as well if we do that, if we plug in a ship. So once we understand the energy demand in the port, I can speak with the energy sector and say, look, we are going to have peaks in demand and we need to do peak shaving or we need to provide different capacities on the grid, but we need to first understand what is the demand of this. The other thing is the economic part of it. Here's an example of Colombian ports and what they pay per energy unit in different terminals. Now this is very interesting because what it's about economy. And we can find there is a 257% difference what one port pays or the other for the same hour of kilowatt. So this is interesting. So this is about economics. So if I can make better procurement, I can be cleaner. If I can switch from diesel to electricity, I know what the economic impact is. So it's really about understanding the dynamics and getting the numbers on the ground and implementing that. We can also see that over time. We can say, okay, how was my price development? Have prices increased or not for my energy? I can start to negotiate as a sector. And I can also understand that for my container, because I might have very good prices, but I'm very inefficient in my work. So I can relate my productivity to energy consumption. And I can differentiate, because it's not the same moving a reefer container or dry container in my port. So what happens if the new Hapag-Lloyd vessels come into my port? They move more than 2,000 reefer boxes on board, and maybe my port needs to handle 500 of them. This will, again, generate this energy peak, and I might want to differentiate for my client what is the energy consumption and emissions for this individual container in my port, because the final client might want to know that. So we need the data to have that. All right, so just to finish, here it's about actually transparency of information. It's about accountability, what is happening, and responsibility. And with this, we can really focus on improvement on the energy consumption, on the emissions, and we very much invite you with our team to join us. We have a question online. You can provide your data, and we'll work with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. So obviously we got a bit of an overview from kind of the research kind of side, but now we actually have Sam, who actually works in the port, and can tell us a bit more about what the Port of Seattle is actually doing concretely to reduce emissions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. I'm going to roam a little bit because I'm a walker. I want to thank my colleagues for their very comprehensive presentations, and I certainly hope that this one will be a nice bow on top by providing some perspectives on a port that's doing this work on the ground. I want to level set our conversation and presentation by first making sure you all understand the nature of the Port of Seattle. And the reason I want to do this is because one of the things that I talk a lot about the Port of Seattle is that we are arguably the most diversified port in North America. And what I mean by that is when you look at our facilities here, you see much of the maritime facilities here that contain our four main lines of businesses: the cargo business, the cruise business, the commercial fishing business, and the recreational marina business. But what I wanted to highlight in this is this teal area here down here in the south end. And this is actually the airport. And I realize that this is a maritime-focused supply chain conference. But you'll understand why later in this presentation I'm highlighting the fact that we also run the airport. When it comes to the maritime sector, you can see here that maritime cargo actually accounts for more than 50% of our greenhouse emissions. If you add the cruise industry, we are far beyond 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions. The way that we have tackled this as a port is a regional approach. And so we have something called the Northwest Clean Air Strategy. What is this? The Northwest Clean Air Strategy is actually a cohort of ports in the Northwest region of the United States and Canada that have all agreed on the same standards of greenhouse gas emission reductions. That includes the Port of Seattle, the Port of Tacoma, the Northwest Seaport Lines, and the Port of Vancouver, BC. Now, why is this important? We all know in this room that decarbonization costs money. At the end of the day, it's a very, very expensive endeavor. And that money ultimately gets passed on to end consumers, whether it's the beneficial cargo owners or the importers. And if we were to be truly honest with ourselves, ports compete with one another for business. And because our pursuit of decarbonization makes it more expensive to do business at the Port of Seattle, we took a regional approach. If the Port of Tacoma, Seattle, and Vancouver, all the major ports in the Northwest region of North America, agree to the same standards, decarbonize by 2050 and half emissions by 2030, then it doesn't matter what port you go to. At the end of the day, every port is pursuing the same decarbonization standards. Now, every port will pursue them in their own ways, but we all know that we're headed towards the same direction. This creates a level playing field between the three major ports of the Pacific Northwest. And for that reason, we don't enter into this race to the bottom amongst the ports. I know Mikhail earlier talked about ports as a hub, and I couldn't agree more. But the perspective that I have as a port commissioner and as a port is we're actually an aggregator of demand for these alternative fuels. right? And you think about it from the fact that if you go back to the slide, you have marine cargo, heavy-duty vehicles as a huge chunk of greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to cruise ships, rail, and other light vehicles. Well, at the end of the day, when you go back to the argument about cost, how do you get fuel costs down? You need scale. How do you get scale? You aggregate demand. And that is why I highlighted our airport, because the work that we're doing on sustainable aviation fuels, in conjunction with cargo vessels, heavy-duty vehicles, cruise vessels, and all the cargo handling equipment and rail within the supply chain, is crucial to aggregating demand in the decarbonization of ports. And so, yes, we are a hub, we are a node, but ports are ultimately also, and can be, aggregators of demand for these alternative fuels, and that is where I think ports play a special role when it comes to these efforts in decarbonization. Lastly, it's really important to note that there are a lot of international collaborations that we need to be looking at and focusing. At the end of the day, I think the point we need to make is that no ports work in isolation of each other. We are a supply chain, a chain, which is why the Port of Seattle and Northwest Cedar Port Alliance is involved in two main corridors. One is the Pacific Northwest Green Corridor with Busan, which was announced at COP27 2 years ago in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And then the second one, which is our green corridor between the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, one of the biggest and the most frequented cruise corridors in North America. And the reason we do this is because we understand that the vessels that go between these ports are not isolated, right? We are more like bus stops than airplanes. And so for that reason, we're looking at, through the collaboration and the help of the Maersk McKinney Moller Center, on how we can work between these different ports and different trade lanes to decarbonize the shipping lanes and the cruise lanes between these ports. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Lovely. Thank you, Sam. I think, obviously, we, as Sam said, we work in a chain. There are a lot of people and different kind of sectors involved when we talk about maritime. So I think I want to talk a bit more about that. So how do you work with the different stakeholders that are involved? And I think, Antonis, I might want to start with you, because just looking at the port readiness tool that you developed, and I think that might be something that we can kind of expand on. So how do you get the support from the different people? And we're having worked with the IPH have followed the work of the IPH of IPH's work over the past few years in a previous job. I know that kind of focuses also on getting to your customers, and that I think might be something that we can talk about a bit more.
No, absolutely. I mean, collaboration, right? A very beautiful word, something that we all agree that it's needed at all levels, and it's vital in that debate. I think is how we really put it in practice, right? Because I think there are also type of mentalities and ways of doing business for so many years, and now it's time. I think we all mentioned it. It's time for a real change here. So we need to reevaluate a bit how we do things overall, I would say. Now, at the level of IPH, of course, from the initial, I think that lately, in the last years, the association itself, apart from the port authorities, we do have our associate members, which are companies providing services to ports at large. But that community is expanding quite a lot with big shippers and big companies like Cargill, like IKEA lately. And in fact, by also working very closely with ship owners, and especially on decarbonization, this is very, very important. At the end, yeah, it is going to come from BCOs, the demand towards cleaner transport as well, and that demand will come to the port as such and everything, and that's how it will work up to a big extent. So to that level, yes. Then you mentioned, of course, and the port readiness level and the work that we do there, but also, obviously, also what I mentioned, the Clean Energy Marine Hubs initiatives. That's where it is indispensable also to bring the silos between, even at the government level, between transport and energy ministries, right? I mean, we're talking about decarbonizing, we're talking about the role as hubs overall. It's not only that transport and energy the people and governments and ministries need to talk to each other. They need to be in the same room, and they need to break out those silos. And of course, within the ports, ship owners, energy manufacturers, and so on. All of them need to be together if we want to really make a change there. And I think the challenge, as I said, change a bit of mentality and realize that it cannot be done otherwise.
Yeah, I think that is. I would hope that is, clear to everyone. But yeah, it's a difference between kind of thinking about it and then putting it into practice. But definitely, and I think Sam, that's probably something you kind of look at as well, like keyword like scope 3 emissions as well. That's something that you deal with as well, right? Where you say, what is a port basically? How far in terms of emissions? How far are we responsible for that, and what kind of feedback can we give?
Yeah, so obviously for any organization or business, scope 3 is the biggest challenge. But I think because the port is a hub with many spokes within the value chain and the supply chain, it's natural for us to convene all the different parties within the supply chain. And at the end of the day, one party's scope 3 emissions could be our scope 1 emissions, right? It's all a matter of perspective, and that's what really gets people to the table. And if you have corporate partners who are serious about reducing their scope 3 emissions, they're willing to go to the table. And so that's what we capitalize on as a port, is convening the Amazons of this world, the Costcos of this world, who are truly serious about reducing their scope 3, and they come to us to see how they could do that. And so we have a very distinct advantage in the Northwest, given the presence of those different spokes.
And Gordon, you seems like you want to add something to this?
No, I was
reaching for the microphone. Please go. Tell us.
But I think you ask about the stakeholder collaboration or the transparency. I think the key is to generate trust between the actors, because we talk about having information about others, if it's a port or along the supply chain, and you need to establish the trust that information is treated accordingly, and that the results are in. And this is where we've been working directly with the government and the ports as well. Say, look, we can maybe bring this objective vision or perspective to the table, help you to benchmark. It's not important who it is. It's not about finger pointing. It's about finding a starting point and setting serious targets. And I think to first have this health check about where am I, and I know like Port of Seattle is very advanced, Hamburg is very advanced, but we have so many ports in Latin America and Africa and Asia that are just starting to understand. And so it's about creating the numbers, creating the data about it, and also creating then the capacity within the port authorities, the terminals, in order that they realize that this information is relevant. We should not forget the major work of a port is moving cargo. And these are all things that are coming on top of them, and they have a cost involved. So we need to also help them to see there's a positive economic impact in being more sustainable and a competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back to that and talk a bit more about the data side as well. I think, Mika, you wanted to add something as well.
I think that everybody in this room and in the world agree upon that collaboration is a key ingredient in moving this forward. What I also think is that we are pretty weak in talking about the how. How do we do good collaboration? And I think that here is it's a very strong need for knowledge here. The way that I think is super important is that we need to reflect that the physical ecosystem of ports and shipping companies and clients, etc., is highly distributed. It's not like that we have a boss that is sitting on top of each other, of this whole system. Is that everybody acts on behalf of themselves. So what we need to do, I think, is that we need to find the selection of stakeholders that needs to be engaged and that they define a common object of interest. And that common object of interest would then serve as a foundation for adding KPIs, etc., to what do we want to achieve together. That would then also be a foundation for acknowledging the different stakeholders' own perspectives. How can I gain most value out of this? Because that is what is going to happen at the end of the day. Everybody is caring for their own sake. But we can contribute together. And my challenge here is when I talk with ports, it is sometimes I almost feel that the ports is the lowest party in the value chain, which I think, Antonis, maybe you also feel sometimes that, okay, there's a shipper on top, and they contract a freight forwarder or go directly to the shipping company, and the shipping company pays a visit, and the ports are super nervous if the ship or if the captain actually takes the wheel and turns it and go to another port. So, having said that, I think that digitalization and collaboration actually offers new opportunities for ports to be directly involved in relation to the shipper. One example would be the connected container or the smart container. There's a lot of information about the goods that they are transporting that can go directly to the shipper. Now they report to the shipping company, and hopefully the shipping company goes back to the shipper, but you never know. So by saying that, I think that a high degree of transparency is enormously important, and that we collaborate on fair grounds. Thanks.
Yeah, agreed. I think that kind of brings me back to that point about gathering baseline data. And I want to go back to Gordon about that, because listening to your presentation made me wonder, maybe, you have some input on that. What's been the feedback from ports in terms of, the effort and also their capacity to collect data, on emissions? Because as Michael said, this is in addition to what, what your daily work is.
I mean, the thing is where we start is asking the port if they know about it. And most of the ports actually don't know how much money they spend on energy per container. And once you ask them, why don't you get your energy bills, and let's sit down at the table and look, how much did you pay for energy last year? So it's like, oh, so much. It's like, yeah, so how is that related in order to your productivity? What strategy do you have? And then what's happened? Oh, yes, being more sustainable is expensive. And they say, well, let's have a look at this. If you electrify, these machinery is much more efficient, and if you take the total cost of ownership, maybe in a few years you recover that investment actually. And this is where you start to have a conversation, because it's in the second tier. It's about the emissions and being more sustainable. Here it's what's worrying the port. I need to be more push. And when we talk about the port, he's a terminal operator, not the necessary authority. And a lot of the global terminal operators obviously have that clear, but they also need to work together with the government. So it's also pushing the governments and asking for this type of information. And then the next question is, but if I electrify my machinery, what is the energy sector going to tell me? And this is what Michael responded, otherwise, and that is very common. We are worried that the lights will turn out in the city next door. And this is where we come back to the collaboration aspect. We say, look, if we can model your energy demand in the future, you want to electrify over the next 5 years, we tell you how you should develop the electricity grid going to that port. And the whole value chain will benefit. And so it's really about not only getting the data out of them, it's okay, trying to interpret the data and asking the whys. Because you find a port and then say, we have that much energy. Yeah, but for your reefer cargoes, you use diesel generators. I'm not surprised. Could we change this? And so it's about having that conversation. And again, I'm not talking about the Hamburgs, the Rotterdams, the Singapores in this world. It's really about getting the small ports on board, because for them it's even more important to do that change. And I'm convinced that they can leapfrog some of the development the bigger ports have done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that global participation is very, very important. I want to go back to that as well. But Sam, do you want to interject as well?
Yeah, real quickly. I think when you think about it from the perspective of ports, there's really two main challenges when it comes to data and collecting data. One is that most ports, if not all ports, are not regulatory agencies. We do not have the ability to enforce a 2030 goal, right? It's aspirational, and we do everything we can from within our first Scope 1 emissions to get there, but we cannot enforce certain emission standards. And then the second one is, and Michael touched upon it, is most ports are not vertically integrated, right? We are landlord-tenant port, which means that we do not directly operate the terminals. We have terminal operators, we have carriers. Asking us to report your emissions data to us is like your apartment owner asking you to report how many times you flush your toilet every day, right? It's a weird thing to ask, right? One mechanism that we have used, however, because we are a landlord-tenant port, we're looking at how we can use our lease agreements to embed the emission standards and reporting? How many times are you plugging into shore power, right? How many, what kind of fuels are you using, what scrubbers? There are things you can bake into a lease agreement at the port level where you say, if you want to operate in our harbor, part of the agreement is that you report things to us. And I think that is going to be one of the models that becomes much more prevalent going forward as a mechanism for us to gather the data that I think that we're all trying to get at.
I mean, maybe as a reaction to that, we have a very interesting example in Chile, because we always focus on the port. In Chile, they actually have an energy efficiency law that comes from the energy ministry, and it's for all sectors and all industry. So, and everybody has to report now about a program of energy efficiency. It doesn't matter if I'm a port or another company or another industry. And I think that's really interesting, because suddenly you get the pressure from somebody else, and what you say, what we could not do in the past, is actually being implemented from somebody else. Because the energy ministry doesn't care if it's a lease agreement or not. You are operating an industry in my country, so I want to see a report. And I think this is also important for the collaboration with the energy sector.
I tend to agree now very much. We are working with 52 small ports in Sweden, and nothing bad about that. I mean, they have been originally developed as serving as a point of transshipment for municipalities, and now the focus is on ports very much more as a business community type of thing, and that also means that suddenly the shippers are starting to pay a lot of attention to the emissions in the corridors, but a very important ingredient in the corridor, as we are now handling all the single units, is what is happening in the port. And if I go to any port in the world and ask what is the emissions that are related to my units, it's very hard to get an answer. So here I think it's a very good and important work that the ports need to do, and maybe this is for International Association of Port and Harbors, really.
No, I mean, and absolutely, let's take that, but I mean, at the same time, I want to kind of not only echo, I mean, when you need to work with stakeholders, that's where collaboration is key. I mean, if you want to do a comprehensive, indeed, carbon footprint, and of course you need to include scope 1, 2, and 3 for that, then you need to involve everybody. Everybody needs to be on board from the same time, but that requires collaboration, indeed, because we cannot enforce this data provision and everything. And then you nailed it, of course, Sam, with lease agreements, clauses as part of concession and lease agreements. That's a powerful tool that ports have in their disposition to not to enforce, because that's a bit of an enforcing element if you do it. But we can do a lot for enabling and for encouraging stuff as well. I mentioned before the environmental CP index. All think about incentives as well, how you can influence behavior as well, or better behavior, and that's another way of saying things as well. So, yeah, plenty to do, plenty to think about it. And again, it comes back to collaboration, but also hearing you, Gordon, Michael, it is, of course, though, we need to acknowledge what is a port authority, which is at large the landlord port authority, which through collaboration and some other type of smart interventions, also enforcing, but mostly enabling and encouraging, needs to work with other partners to enable a change on the way. Yeah.
Just to add another comment here, what I think and what I realize, and I think that maybe Gordon and myself play that role sometimes, and that is to be maybe you also do as an international organization, is that these type of collaborative efforts requires an orchestrator. And for us, our experience is that if Port of Seattle walks in and say that let's do something together, then you better come to a table where everybody is equal, and that is sometimes very challenging when you come to the maritime industry, but my experience now, if I come with the body of a research institute, as an example, it could be an academic institution as well, that we have a role to play this objective if we just know what we are talking about.
I think in future we will obviously, as you say, see much more cooperation. I think, be better connected, and that hopefully will contribute also to connect lesser developed parts and other developed parts. But I think that also means, does the more developed port have a responsibility to kind of support the smaller ports, but then we kind of talking about like kind of social responsibility. At the same time, you could think this might be a good way to like expand, but is that something that we will see?
I think you know, when I was at MEPC last year at the IMO, we were pitched about on this program the IMO is initiating where the larger developed ports would mentor the SIDS or developing ports. And I think there's value in that because we have what you might call the first mover advantage, right? We're doing it first, onshore power. We'll be the first port on the West Coast to have 3 onshore power capable terminals. But there were a lot of lessons learned there. And it could have been a lot cheaper had we known those lessons beforehand. And so those lessons learned can be transferred to the developing ports so that they can avoid some of those pit traps. If we knew a lot of the know-how that we have now, we could have saved over $40+ million in cost, right? And so I think from that perspective, there is tremendous value in the Ambergs and the Rotterdams and the Seattles of this world, mentoring and helping the SIDS and the smaller ports avoid some of the pit traps of decarbonization, for sure.
I think this is super interesting, Sam. I come from a situation where the largest port in the Nordic region is Port of Gothenburg. And that is not a big port in the international sense. The rest of the 51 ports, they are super small. So in Port of Gothenburg, you would have an IT department with several people. In Port of Karlshamn or Port of whatever of these other ones, you would have maybe 20% of a position would cater for the IT questions. That means that they are so concerned about collaborating with other ports in actually to join forces and to overcome this effort that it means to on the digitalization of ports and on the decarbonization of ports, etc., etc. And here I think the big ports needs to help, of course, but we need to be extremely careful also so that I used to say that, okay, Singapore is doing this and this and this, and then I bring it to the small port that is a super small fraction of what Singapore is doing, and that translation is really complicated, I must say that.
No, absolutely, but I think that's where I see a clear role for IPAs as well, and that's what we do actually. We have those working streams where indeed, I mean, front-runner ports will get there because they have the capacity to offer, they face these problems in an urgent way, and they develop tools and methodologies, but then it is our role as an association to commit to capacity building and to bring or to try to bring or adapt those tools so that everybody can use them and bring everybody at the same level. And we do that, of course, then port competition and sharing of knowledge and experiences and practices. And also we are active in committing with our colleagues at the International Maritime Organization as well, the Green Voyage 2050 program, to draw capacity building programs with other partners as well and make sure we can help the global port community to not only to catch up, and just one last thing, of course decarbonization is like that, but we're managing a sustainability project database. And over there, all ports of the world are submitting sustainability initiatives. And it's true that when it comes to decarbonization, the big ports, the more developed ports are fantastic, but when it comes to social initiatives, and that's also an aspect of sustainability, we can learn a lot from ports in developing countries and the actual initiatives that are undertaken, and that's clear from our sustainability database as well. But I'll stop it here because it's not decarbonization.
Yes, yeah, no, that's very true, and obviously you're welcome to continue the discussion afterwards. But I think as a kind of final point, we want to look at some concrete measures that we can take, because obviously I think we all agree ports can definitely play a big role in facilitating decarbonization. But as if you look at the numbers I've given you at the beginning, I think you can see there's slow movement, because I think there's this chain of kind of waiting where an engine manufacturer waits for the ship owner to make a decision what fuel they would want, so that they can then they then develop the engines for that. And then the ports are waiting for the ship owners to say this is the fuel that we want provided to us, while I think the ship owner waits for the port to say this is the fuel we will provide. So which obviously then that creates kind of delays and kind of just waiting what's going on. So I think if each of you can just briefly kind of give me a concrete measure you'd like to see done in the next 5 years that could get us out of that kind of waiting situation and get concrete measures on. Or if there's something that you have that want to commit to as well, then obviously you put it on record here.
Can I start? Well, for me, I have to look again at the direction of IMO and MEPC on that, because I think that the most important measure to be taken, and it has to be taken not in the next 5 years, but probably in the next 1 or 2 years, is the adoption of an economic instrument by IMO that will give really a fairer chance to all those new fuels. And I think that this would accelerate developments and maybe will filter out a bit that the debate on which fuels we're going to or what exactly the mix will contain. But we need an economic measure, and we need it for 2 ways. We need it to give a fairer chance to the new fuels, and we need it also to support a just and equitable transition by the redistribution of these revenues and by developing that infrastructure that is needed, using part of these revenues as well in ports in developing countries in particular.
Call me if you want an orchestrator. I'm not kidding. I think that I have 2 messages. One is that we need to take a holistic approach. I talked about digitalization and collaboration, but do not forget that we cannot separate the societal concerns from the economic concerns or incentives. That's one thing. The other one I would also say is that we cannot just rely on policy. I think its policy is fantastic. I think that provides a good security for investments, etc. But we also need to listen to the industry and how they are moving forward.
Yeah,
thanks.
Good.
Okay, very clear. I think, first of all, the important thing is that we have a framework with an ISO standard available to measure it, and that's key for the whole transport chain, not only terminals. And the other message is you really have to focus on what your role is. It's a port authority as a terminal operator. And if everybody really starts to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, the scope 3 emissions of the other one will also be better. So I think sometimes we are lost in talking about scope 3 emission. That's so difficult because that needs to be done by collaboration, but we forget acting on the scope 1 and 2 emissions. So I would really like to see by 2035 all the terminals electrified, then we would have a major step in scope 1 and 2 emissions, right?
Okay, yeah. Sam, will we see that?
I would love to see that. I think for me, I would love to see a study that really breaks down the energy demands based on the sectors. You have to remember, maritime only accounts for maybe 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Let's be honest with ourselves. Maritime is not going to be at the forefront of driving what sustainable fuel we use in the future, right? But if you add the heavy-duty trucks and everything else within the port ecosystem, you can actually converge on something where we know which fuels are going to be the most used, whether it's ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, et cetera. And so what we need to do is really break down the study that goes beyond just the cargo carriers, but also looks at every layer of a port. And you may end up in a situation where you say, well, actually, this is going to create too much demand for one fuel, and we need to diversify a little bit. I don't know how that study would follow, or what it would conclude, but I do think we need that broken down study of how much demand we have for each sector of the value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. More baseline data. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for spending the past hour with us. Thank you to you as well. And I think we're going straight into the next panel from here on.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. This is about the time in the afternoon when we'd all like a coffee break, but hopefully we'll be holding your attention and stimulating you in the next hour. You can see the title of this session. It's got the words sustainability and resilience in the title. These are probably the two most heavily used words over the past day and a half. I don't know, some of you may be suffering forum fatigue whenever you hear those two words mentioned. So we've got a challenge to try to take a new angle on these subjects to maintain your interest. And one angle we're going to take is looking at the interrelationship between sustainability and resilience as that relates to freight transport and logistics. And to help me discuss this, I've got a very distinguished panel. So on my immediate left is a fellow Brit, John Manos-Bell. Some of you may have heard him moderate the first session today. So John is the founder and CEO of Transport Intelligence, one of the main market research companies for global logistics, and the author of many books as well. So I don't know when you find the time, John. And then we have Zira Zeng from Maersk. She heads up the business continuity consulting unit within Maersk. So that brings shipping expertise to the panel. Then we've got Darwin from the Port Management Association of the Caribbean, but you also have a day job in being the CEO of the port and Antigua. So obviously ports are critical both to the decarbonisation and to the resilience of global supply chains. So again, it's great having you on the panel. And then finally, at the end, we have Miriam from ECLAC, who again has been in other panels today. I mean, you've been overworked as far as I can see. And she has responsibilities for infrastructure and resilience. So this is going to bring varied perspectives really to our subject area. As moderator, I'm going to have the liberty of giving a short presentation really to set the scene and to flag up some of the key issues that we're going to be addressing. So I'll go over to the lectern. Perhaps I should say a few words about myself. So I work at the Kuhne Logistics University in Hamburg, which we think is the only logistics university in the world. It was set up in 2010. It's a legacy project of Klaus Michael Kuhne, who is the majority owner of Kuehne Nagel, and we get funded by the Kuhne Foundation, and there are some members of the foundation here today. We're still a small university. We have about 30 professors and about 400 students, but we're just about to globalize, so we're hoping to open up mini KLUs around the world. So anyway, what I thought I would do is look at this interrelationship between resilience and sustainability as it relates to logistics. Because in the discussions I've heard over the past day and a half, I think there's an implicit assumption that what we do to make supply chains more sustainable will also make them more resilient. Well, is that true? To what extent may there be conflicts between the two? Just to set the scene, a couple of photo mosaics, one on sustainability, reminding ourselves of all the negative externalities of freight transport, covering all the different transport modes. It's a fairly dirty profession that we're in, and we should obviously be doing everything we can to improve its environmental sustainability. And then on the resilience side, some photographs just to recall the recent history of supply chain disruptions. Again, over the past 2 days, a lot of the discussion has been on what's happened in the past 2 or 3 years. But if you take a 20-year perspective on this, you can see there have been a lot of mega disruptions of supply chains. I'm an academic, as I've said. There has been an explosion of academic literature on how we deal with these supply chain disruptions over the past 20 years. So how do we define resilience here? This is my preferred definition, comes from Professor Yossi Sheffi at MIT. Those 8 words seem to me to sum it up. It says it's the ability to bounce back from large-scale disruptions. Used to be we thought we could bounce back rapidly so that supply chain disruptions would have a V profile, and then some disruptions were big and took longer to recover from, so they've got a sort of U profile. And then, of course, there are examples of different disruptions occurring in quick succession, and they've got a W profile. And what's been happening in recently, we never seem to get back to where we started, right? There's a very irregular profile, I think, for many of these supply chain disruptions. And as a result of that, some people are suggesting that we shouldn't be thinking anymore about resilience. It's rather adaptation. It's not that we're going to be bouncing back to some previous state, rather we're bouncing forward to some new normal. But again, to give this some historical perspective, I mean, I've been an academic now for 44 years in this field. I've written textbooks, I've lectured hundreds, thousands of students. And I, like other supply chain professors, have been preaching a paradigm for the way in which we manage supply chains, comprising these various things, encouraging centralization of inventory, single sourcing of procurement, globalization, obviously, just-in-time replenishment, minimum inventory, tightly coupling processes. This has been portrayed as best practice in the way we manage our supply chains. And that's been great because it's delivered lots of economic benefit, but the downside is it's made our supply chains extremely vulnerable. And this is what I call self-inflicted vulnerability. And it seems to me this model of supply chain management is just not sufficiently robust anymore for this new era that we have entered of turbulence and unpredictability. And potentially it's not going to help us decarbonize our supply chains. It's leaving our logistics systems perhaps a lot more carbon intensive than they need to be. So what I'd like us to consider in this session is this relationship between resilience and environmental sustainability. 2 years ago, there was an article in Forbes magazine, that was the title, suggesting that what we do to make our supply chains more sustainable will also make them more resilient. I'm not entirely convinced. I think there are some ways in which sustainability and resilience will probably be well aligned. In other cases, there'll probably be some trade-offs. One thing we can maybe agree upon right at the start, however, is that there are some things that we can do in the management of our supply chains which will yield both sustainability and resilience benefits. One is improving supply chain visibility, allowing us, for example, to measure the Scope 3 emissions, which were discussed in the previous panel, but also to build up risk profiles of the upstream supply chain, which will help us to improve resilience. And the second thing is supply chain collaboration. No question that if we do that properly, it will help us to make better use of our logistics assets, and that will yield economic as well as environmental benefits. But it will also permit joint contingency planning so that companies can work together to try to minimize the risk exposure to their supply chain. So those two things, it seems to me, are well aligned. But if we think on the one side of all the things that we can do to improve the sustainability of freight transport, it seems to me basically there are 5 things. One is we can just constrain the growth of freight movement. Secondly, we can get as much freight as possible onto lower carbon transport modes. The third is to optimize our use of freight transport and logistics assets, fill the vehicles and the ships and the aircraft. We can improve the energy efficiency. And then finally, we can reduce the carbon content of the energy we use. And I think everything falls into one of those 5 categories. And then on the and maybe I should say that the first of these may not be appropriate in every country. Again, if one looks at history, you see there's a very close correlation between the growth of economies and the growth of freight movement. And therefore, countries at an earlier stage in their economic development probably will not be too keen to constrain freight movement for the fear that that would jeopardize their future economic prospects. And then on the other side, if we look at the main things you can do to improve the resilience of a supply chain, some people argue you can do that by localizing the sourcing, shortening the supply chain. You can decentralize production and warehousing, reversing the processes of the past few decades. We could relax the just-in-time principle, building more inventory into our supply chains. We could try to reduce our dependence on high-risk sources, either particular companies or countries. And then finally, we could just diversify procurement, both of products and services. Now, what I've done here is try to map the interrelationship between those sustainability options and the resilience options. And I've made a distinction between the interconnections which I regard as synergistic, where they're working in harmony, and the ones where there would be a trade-off. Now, I don't have time now to go through and talk about every link in that diagram, but what I would like to do is just focus on two of the resilience measures to see to what extent they might also improve sustainability. And the first is this widely discussed idea that somehow if we deglobalize the global economy, if we reshore or nearshore, something that John was talking about in the first session today, that will make our supply chains more resilient. And I have to say that I've read a lot of literature in this area, both the academic literature and the popular press, and I think a lot of it's a bit naive. They tend to think of global supply chains as connecting factories in China with distribution centers in Europe or North America. It's a unidimensional view. In effect, global value chains, supply chains are immensely complicated, and therefore it's not very clear what we mean by actually shortening supply chains. If there were a pronounced process of deglobalization underway, that's going to take a while. It'll take a while for value chains to be reconfigured. And at the end of the day, that need not actually improve the resilience of supply chains. Because if we concentrate more of our sourcing in the home market or in near markets, that can also carry risks. And then the implications of this for environmental sustainability, no question, if we reduce the amount of trade-related freight transport, that will reduce the related negative externalities. So there would be environmental benefits in that. However, once you do a full product life cycle analysis, what you discover is that a lot of international trade is actually good for the environment, where the emissions are lower in the exporting country than they are in the importing country. And so it's reckoned about a third of international trade actually yields a net emission reduction. The other thing is that our global supply chains rely on shipping. And we've heard so often that shipping accounts for about 80% of international trade. And that is by far the lowest carbon transport mode. So therefore, if we shorten a deep sea freight movement, for example, that is not going to dramatically reduce emissions. And then the final point is that if we were to deglobalize, that I think would have an adverse effect on the development prospects of many countries. And that would then make it harder for these countries actually to deal with the environmental crisis. So I think we've got to be aware of the complexities really in debating this one. And then my second option is relaxing the just-in-time principle. That got a lot of attention during the pandemic. That was from an article in the Financial Times saying that businesses should be moving from a just-in-time process of replenishment to a just-in-case one to build more inventory into their supply chains. But there's been an academic backlash against that recently. This is a journal paper just published a few months ago defending just-in-time, saying that in the popular press, the just-in-time principle has been misunderstood. And that many companies have been misapplying it. So what they argue is, okay, there may be a case for building up inventories of certain critical materials, but we would be foolish to abandon the just-in-time principle. And then if we look at the environmental implications of relaxing just-in-time, that could yield some benefits as far as freight transport is concerned, because it would allow us then to consolidate loads and make better use of vehicle and vessel capacity. It would make it easier to shift transport mode from road to rail or from air to sea. It would also allow us maybe to slow down the freight movement. I published a journal paper back in 2016 suggesting that supply chain deceleration should be considered as a way of decarbonising supply chains. But again, we've got to be careful. We might cut our freight-related emissions, but relaxing just in time would almost certainly increase emissions from warehousing and from factories. So until you do a proper holistic analysis, it's very hard to judge exactly what the net effects would be on emissions. And we should also recognise that just-in-time is not just a stock control system. It is a whole business philosophy designed to minimise waste, and that includes the waste of energy. And the other thing is our production, our logistics systems, after decades, have adapted to just-in-time. So we lack the storage capacity, for example, to simply increase inventory levels. So it would take a while and involve a lot of investment, it seems to me, to move to a sort of non-JIT world of higher inventory production and distribution. And then finally, this is my final slide, to see how all of this relates to SIDS. Obviously, I've just some general points I will make. This is partly reiterating what I've heard over the past couple of days, that the feeling that the location size, heavy trade dependence, reliance on single mode of transport, which characterize the SIDS, has the effect of amplifying the effects of global supply chain disruptions. And hence the need for this conference, it seems to me, because this highlights the importance of this subject to small islands. But they are also very vulnerable to natural disasters. So in addition to the problems they have in being interconnected into global supply chains, they have localized problems in that given their locations, predominantly in the tropics, they suffer from natural hazards, as you can see, and that's very costly. IPCC, in its sixth assessment report last year, actually said this, that small islands present the most urgent need for investment in capacity building and adaptation strategies. Obviously, in these islands, very close link between economic development, resilience and sustainability, which I think will come out in our discussion. And then, just to end on a more positive note, something which will help SIDS both to improve sustainability and improve resilience is the move from fossil fuel to renewable energy. It will be costly, it will take time, but ultimately it will deliver benefits on both fronts of sustainability and resilience. Okay, so that's my perspective on all of this. I'll shut up now and I'll invite my fellow panelists to give their opinions. So I'd like first to turn to John Manners-Bell. And John, I don't know what your reaction is to this. I mean, John has published a book recently called The Death of Globalization, which is very provocative. But I think you're also going to talk to us a little bit about the social dimension of sustainability, because I simply talked about the environmental one, but there's a lot more to sustainability, clearly. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Alan, again for a masterclass presentation on sustainability. Yes, when we had original conversations about the angle that I could take when presenting to you, I went back in my mind to some work that we undertook when we were both on the Logistics and Supply Chain Council of the World Economic Forum, and that related to what we called at the time the triple advantage. That's the role of people, planet, and profits in creating sustainable and resilient, that catchphrase again, and inclusive. Can I add another one there?
By all means.
Yeah, and inclusivity as well. And that work we did still holds very good, I think, in terms of when we're talking about those particular issues. And I think it's one area which probably hasn't been covered as much as the environmental impact of supply chain in the conference so far. So I feel confident about talking a little bit more about the ethical and societal dimension of supply chains. And this certainly was picked up yesterday, if you remember, by Prime Minister Motley, who said that supply chains start with people, and we need to ensure decent work. But I think one of the trends that we've seen over the last 20, 30, 40 years, as we've all very much aware of globalization, has been it's very difficult now to ensure that OEMs, the supply chain owners, actually can have the visibility of what's going on at a lower level in terms of the lower level tier suppliers. Prime Minister Motley was absolutely right. It starts with people. So when we're talking about harvesting fresh fruit and vegetables or harvesting bananas, or if we look at other sectors in terms of critical minerals in the Congo, or if we're looking at the fashion sector and the conditions in which workers in Bangladesh or other parts of Asia are being employed in to enable us in the developed world, talking personally, to be able to get $3 T-shirts or whatever it is. So I think it's hugely important that we really talk about the levels of visibility in the lower tiers, because modern supply chains are complex, multi-tiered, and opaque, as we all know. And just to quote one survey on this, I think 75% of supply chain managers, when interviewed, believed that modern slavery existed at tier 3 in their supply chains, which is absolutely incredible, because it's not, many supply chains have 5, 6, 7 levels of suppliers. And so if you're just talking about 3/4 of suppliers employing people under what could be called modern slavery terms, I think that's a real eye-opener. There are lots of issues related to this. I won't go on, I won't talk too much in my introductory notes, but it's maybe something that we can come back to. There's a lot of work being undertaken. There's a lot of legislation being passed in the EU. We saw the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive being passed earlier this year, which will have an impact. But there are also unintended consequences of all this legislation which is being passed, which I think needs discussion. Because if it results in more costs being placed in certain on the leaders of supply chains, on the OEMs, then that's going to impact on sourcing policies, and that might mean that they actually pull investment out of developing markets, which is exactly the opposite of what these legislation is designed to achieve. So it's a very nuanced, it's a very complex issue. Legislation probably is taking maybe a very broad brush or blunt approach to it, and as I say, this could end up with unintended consequences which really need discussion. So I'll leave it there, Alan.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for that, John, and we'll come back, I think, and pick up on some of those points shortly. Okay, moving on now to Zira. So your day job obviously relates to business continuity. So yeah, this is pretty fundamental, clearly, to resilience. And I think you were suggesting you're developing a partnership possibly with UNCTAD. So would you like to introduce yourself and comment on that? Yep.
Yes, and okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And also allow me to extend my thanks to UNTAG, especially the DTL team for inviting me to this great event, and also to give me the opportunity to share my insight and discussing this important topic, sustainability and the resilience of supply chains. Also a bit about my job, and actually you see that my role in Maersk is responsible for the global business resilience consulting in Maersk. So actually my function is newly created 2 years ago. This is also underscore the increasing need from that we observe from the customer side. So a lot of Maersk customers, maybe some of you sitting over there, is actually, especially with these 2 years, these 2 or 3 years, and actually we are seeing the growing uncertainties and the disruptions hitting our supply chain. And from customer side, actually, we also seeing they are struggling with that. They see the importance of having resilience in places, but they don't really know how to do it. So we also established these functions to really help our customers to work together on supply chain resilience. To address that, we actually internally developed we call the Maersk Supply Chain Resilience Module. That's kind of a methodology we use to help our customer identify the vulnerabilities and they have, the dependency they have on their supply chain, and also to hands-on with them to develop the contingency plan against these, in case of loss of these dependency, what they're gonna do. And also for some specific crises, disruptions, and also we provide the risk insight and also foresight as well to our customers. Also, part of my job is also involved in the real crisis management cases at Maersk. I see that Professor Allen said at the beginning, showing these a lot of pictures about these disasters. Quite a few things, like the Suez Canal blockage, if you recall, that's happened in 2021. That I got involved in the contingency planning, and so when the vessels are blocked there, so how we gonna manage the crisis, how we gonna manage the customer communication. So also for the ones in 2022, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, also I'm working with a lot of functions within Maersk on these contingency planning. We also worked closely with the UN different functions to continue move some essential goods and deliver into Ukraine, for example. So actually, this is also allows me to really have the insight about what's going on, what's the development of the situation, and meanwhile also to allow us to work closely with our customer to provide them the timely information of the situations. A part of that, also I have been contributed to some key publications like the UNTAG, the Port Resilience Guidebook that was released 2 years ago. Actually, as Professor Allen mentioned at the beginning, recently we've also having, I'm also quite happy with that, is we are having an ongoing dialogue with the UNTAG team to develop, to have the partnership to further enhance the supply chain resilience together. Also, I see that through this partnership, we probably can contribute significantly by sharing the knowledge, good experience, and also to even collaborate in some projects that aim to improve and enhance the supply chain, global supply chain resilience. So on specific on that ones, and actually we also expect to have some detailed initiatives that to be aligned, to be agreed by both parties in the following. And also I'm really excited that that we can work together and collaborate together and to really drive and push, contribute as well to the global supply chain dynamics. So that's about myself.
Can I be a bit naughty, Zira, and ask you, to what extent do you and your business continuity unit within Maersk interact with the people responsible for decarbonizing shipping? Is there a formal interaction between the two?
Yeah, that's also a quite interesting question. You know, Maersk, we have employees, more than 100,000 employees globally. So we do have a relatively large team on sustainability. A lot of people are working on that. And also because of Maersk business is across not just ocean business or shipping business, but also we having our terminal, AP Muller terminals globally. And also we have our own logistic teams that really have our own trucking fleet. And even we have our own aircraft fleet, by the way. So our sustainability actually across these functions to work on, for example, especially on the transitions toward these green fields and also closely working with different functions, asset functions on these green infrastructures that need to be invested by Maersk. So between the sustainability and the resilience, so we also work in a closer collaboration because we do see there's definitely a large room we need to collaborate. We seeing the climate change, how climate change and make a difference and make an impact on the supply chain. On the countries as well. So we do see that also, no matter from the sustainability side or even from the resilience side, we do feel that we can definitely play a role to really help with the countries and also help with the supply chains and global supply chain, help with our customer to really navigate through these uncertainties. So
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. So we are the three visitors to the Caribbean. Our last two panelists have got local knowledge. So over to you, Darwin. I mean, so from your sort of Caribbean port perspective, I mean, how do you react to this relationship between sustainability and resilience? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I'd like to thank UNCTAD for the opportunity to be part of this forum. And I am particularly grateful to be speaking of a very important subject, which is relevant to every small island in the world, which is how do you maintain or develop sustainable transport logistics. There's some very basic facts about living on an island. In many instances, you have one port. There are some islands with multiple ports. And so your typical mode of transport is maritime. And so there is a very interesting focus. Instead of trying to develop too many options, because you become centralized with clear knowledge that 95% of your goods travel by sea. That means you zoom in the focus on how do you create resilience and sustainability for maritime transport. We are challenged, however, as small islands by some realities. One of them, I was listening to your slide here, it spoke about development capacity, development funding. As a matter of fact, when I saw the map with the islands of the Caribbean as red, I thought about the danger that exists every year for us, created by other international entities exposing us to significant vulnerabilities. And we almost appear to be a path for transporting the ills of nature constantly through where we live. That being said, our resilience is challenged by our own capacity to design systems that are sustainable and resilient. I am the chairman of the Port Management Association of the Caribbean. We represent 26 different ports, and of all these ports, it would be clear that we can say none of us are at a position where we can say we are indeed sustainable or resilient in terms of the context, international context. Additionally, when we look at our capacity to provide development funding, there are some agencies in the world that will say to islands like Barbados and Antigua and some others that your per capita income is too high to allow you to get development funding. And those same agencies will say, but you have to design them anyway. And so there are factors that limits our capacity to actually get to our resilient position, and some of those are outside of our capabilities. Now, as it relates to our ports themselves, of the 26 ports, most of them, 90%, were built in the 1960s. So I'm not sure we should be speaking about resilience and sustainability for those ports. We should be talking about appropriate development models that would first position those ports to be efficient in fulfilling their mandates from an infrastructural perspective. And I think the need to point that out to the world as we move so swiftly towards implementing regulations that are creating further burdens on these ports, because we have not yet moved to any high level of development, but we're being told with the recently implemented CII regulations by the IMO, you now need to ensure that you facilitate traffic through your ports efficiently to minimize the impact of carbon creation, carbon production. And in reality, we are just not in that space. And it would be unwise for us to go beyond where we are as a region to even suggest that we are prepared to do so. And the clarion cry from the region is, what do we do? So we've already started seeing impacts of the CII on our ports. We have Haiti that lost one. We have other smaller islands that are already losing traffic, where ships are pulling back, trying to make adjustments. And then the noise in our ears from shipping lines are become more efficient. You have to be more efficient, otherwise we don't know what's coming. So there's some great challenges that face us as small island ports, but it's not related to the issue of resilience just yet. Now I might add, even in having that discussions, that as the discussion on resilience and sustainability and net zero continues, we are further challenged by which type of fuel or which type of source of energy will actually emerge. So at one point we're talking about solar, wind, and remember we are receiving information. We sometimes try to participate in the global space, but there are limits to how far our voices can reach. We thank you for this opportunity today to have one. And so we will say that we need to understand as a region more clearly what's the direction. And once that direction is made out, there has to be a supporting component that says, we're going to provide some support to get you there. Because the small island states, we need those supporting elements to do that. And there can be no clearer example of the need for some support than what the IMO recently implemented carbon intensity index is threatening to do to our region. The threat that poses to quality of life living in the island itself is quite a challenge, because as ships navigate the score of the CII and try to meet a level that doesn't get them into further problems, it's impacting our islands, and our ports are not prepared to respond. So I'm here saying we have a conundrum. Our ports are not prepared, the global mandate is in, and if there is a need for a resilient response to a sustainable way of life for our people, we are asking for that now to the IMO, to the UN and the other agencies. We need to find a way to ease the pressure. We're not advocating for ships, because the ships will fight their way through. As a matter of fact, if you look at global shipping, the big giants are able to speak boldly of their capacity to make the adjustments, they make the investments, they have the tools to do so. But we, with ports that rely almost 100% on maritime, we need some space and some support to get to that space where we can begin to start speaking about the type of impact that we can have in terms of the global transition from heavy fuels into more renewables. And we want to, but sometimes your hand can't reach as far as you'd like it to. And we're saying to the best part of the world, which we are, cruise ships are coming in and they're asking us for shore power, okay? We want to give them shore power, but one cruise ship takes 15 megawatts, and Antigua supplies 30 a day, and that just tells you if there are 5 cruise ships, it outpaces the production capacity of our entire island. And so when the maritime desire for that sort of capacity shows up, we better figure out what do we do. And so that requires a discussion. Why? We are 68% of world cruising. So for cruising to decarbonize, our ports need to be addressed. And I am not so much even concerned about cruising per se, and I love cruising, and that's my mandate as well. but it is what's going to happen to our cargo ships that feed us that I'm mostly worried about, because those have a whole different requirement. So if there is a space on this panel in the audience, or there's an IMO rep, we're looking for a little carve out. It's not a nice word, but I'll say throughout this whole SIDS meeting, we want to have a carve out for our region, for small islands. And I hope we can get someone who wants to have a resilient discussion in that respect. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darwin. I found that very enlightening. I'm not a mainstream maritime specialist, but I thought CII, the Carbon Intensity Index, just related to the vessel. I didn't realize there were wider implications for the ports. So I think that's been a very important point you've made.
Yeah. The vessel doesn't exist by itself. It comes to us. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. Antigua has a crane, so we can discharge 22 moves an hour. And the ship is kind of happy. It wants more, but it's at least getting 22. The next two islands don't have cranes. And so that ship will only discharge 7 or 8. And so you see the productivity disparity immediately. But hold on. When it gets to that second port, there's a cruise ship. That means it has to wait now before it goes in to use its crane to discharge 7 moves an hour. That's a reality that can change tomorrow or next week. And so therein lies where we have to understand that we're not speaking about putting the pressure on classifying a ship. We're saying we're going to impact people. And ports serve people. Ships bring cargo to us, but we serve our citizens, and we're advocating for them. And we're going to keep doing that for the next 2 days.
Yes, excellent. So you've articulated that point very effectively, and hopefully we might get some response from some of the decision makers in the room. So thank you for that. And then, last but not least, Miriam, I think you were going to talk to us a bit about the work you did during the pandemic. Is that right? So maybe you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, moderating this panel with all the colleagues. And thank you, UNTAD, again for this invitation. Bueno, I would like to in the morning they say I work at the central bank. As well, there was a total change, of visibility during the 90s. When I was there, always we were thinking about the economic crisis, the financial crisis, and we didn't think about the environmental, social crisis. During the pandemic, before the pandemic, when we heard about resilience, always we thought about environmental, climate change impact for resilience. We didn't have that work of resilience in other aspects. I can say that when the COVID crisis arrived, we have, as we have mentioned, all the disruptions of the supply chain, and finally, the countries that were the more connected, they have the best infrastructure transport, were the ones, those who were benefit from the access to the vaccines. And I was going to say that project that at ECLAC that I'm looking at, Ricardo Sanchez, that he was the chief in that moment when they implemented this project together with UNTAD and all the regional commissions. And that it's about that, about the transport and trade connectivity in the age of pandemics. In that moment, it was something very, very new for everyone, to have not only, as always, economic or financial crisis. In that moment, there was a sanitary crisis, an environmental crisis, that at the beginning, it was like a ball of snow, At the beginning, it started, and even when they have the impact on inflation, no, with all the disruption of the supply chain and the freight rate that they start to increase, no, all the, because of the congestion and bueno, all the disruptions, they thought that the inflation was a transitory impact, and it was at the end not transitory, no, at the end, and so everything was new for everyone. So UNTAD, together with the 5 regional commission, start to analyze this topic, and they implement a project to aid all the countries worldwide to face this crisis. In this project, there were 3 clusters, and they attack the contactless solution, the seamless connectivity, and the collaborative solutions. In the case of Latin America, they cover many countries, and as well they work with the Association of Caribbean States. No, they were really affected because of the isolation. No, together with the landlocked countries, no, Bolivia and Paraguay, they were really affected. So bueno, they were working together, and in that moment they gave technical assistance to several countries, and they covered different topics as inland waterways, global airship. In that moment, they organized together with ESCAP the implementation of airships, no, that is for isolated countries, no, is a mode of transport that could be used. And they made some analysis of the regional distribution of vaccines and technological policies. They advanced. One of the things that we are sure that the COVID crisis accelerate all the digitalization, all the, no, in many countries. No, all the cybersecurity, the diagnosis of digital infrastructure, smart logistics. So they, no, we cover many topics, and in general, UNTAD and all the commissions at the beginning, with the respective region, they made an assessment of the situation. No, when they have the assessment, they made some recommendations, and then they implement the recommendation through technical assistance with the countries, and they provide these policy recommendations. After they make capacity building. So it was a great lesson, no? The pandemic, and then when everything was, we thought that it started to stabilize. Ukrainian conflict with Russia arrived, now Gaza. So now we are living constantly in several crises. So we have to prepare our countries to be more resilient in all these dimensions, no, and more sustainable. Thank you very much.
Good point. They always say never waste a good crisis. You know, so the systems that you've put in place will be able to deal generically with all sorts of future shocks, isn't it? And I'm sure the same applies to supply chains in different parts of the world as well. So that's great. So thank you for all of these comments. I've got a few other questions I would like to pose. One is the future role of technology in all of this. You know, if we're trying to combine sustainability and resilience in the way we manage our supply chains, broadly defined. I mean, this could be from a corporate perspective, it could be from a shipping line perspective or a government perspective. Are there technological developments you see on the horizon which will make it easier to achieve this balance of sustainability and resilience? John, have you any thoughts on that, or anyone else who?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think, and this probably relates a little bit to one of the topics we talked about this morning in my session, digitization and the disruptive impact which that can have on flows of goods. Why is digitization important? Well, it could enable the movement of shipments across a region. It reduces the friction at border, and that has an impact, environmental impact. I think one of the figures I've seen published, I think, by the WTO was that if you were able to reduce friction at a land border, then you reduce carbon emissions at that land border by 85%. So that's a win-win. If you talk about digitization and creating visibility at different tiers of the supply chain, that's hugely important as well, enabling any player within the supply chain to have a look at the environmental practices of Tier 3 or the ethical practices at Tier 3. So technology has a really important role to play in all these factors.
And also AI, I think, is increasingly being deployed. I mean, organizations like, I think, Everstream Analytics and Resilinked and so forth are using machine learning and AI to try to predict future shocks to supply chains as well. Darwin, did you want to add something on this side from a port perspective?
Yeah, we have been working on a project with the IMO, which is the implementation of maritime single windows throughout the Caribbean. And here is a perfect example of collaboration that yielded great fruits. With the country of Norway, we were given the training, the technology. We developed in Antigua and Barbados the first maritime single window in the Caribbean. Today, we have agencies training to roll out that maritime single window. And within the next 4 weeks with the IMO, we will be rolling out the maritime single window through all of the OECS and other PMAC ports. So we're going to be doing that very, very soon with the IMO. Now, we got that support from Norway for free, and we are extending the benefits to all our ports the same way. There's no charge. Our people go in, we help get it implemented, and we're hoping that that works. What does that do for us in an era where efficiency and resilience and sustainability of supply chain is an urgent need? It means that ships who would normally take an hour, 2 or 3 hours to be cleared can now be cleared electronically 3 miles out. So a region where officers and other people would require 6 to 8 people to board the ship and sit and have a drink, all of that goes out the window. And in almost the next few weeks in Antigua, there'll be no one boarding the ship. It will be done digitally, and then we're going to replicate that across the region. So there is an example of how, with goodwill, a bit of collaboration, we can do great things, and we're about to do that with this implementation of this digital format. And the next step being that we're going to link this maritime window with all the ports, so we can see when the ships are cleared across the region, so that we can now have, for the first time, a connectivity that builds greater efficiency, greater resilience, and sustainability. Now, I said a few words just now. The IMO helped us, Norway helped us. Yeah, so if we can continue getting some help, we can continue doing great things in regards to some of the challenges we have.
Yep. And Sarah, in the course of your work, I suspect digitalization must feature quite prominently. I mean, working with Maersk customers to help them secure their supply chains. Is that right? So am I right in thinking that?
Yes, absolutely. I think to Maersk, digitalization and also the use of these new emerging technology is definitely important. Also, I want to link to what John just mentioned about these regulations and on the compliance and to push really the full visibility of a supply chain. To ensure, your suppliers and not your direct shipper or consignee, to also beyond the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, to also make sure they are compliant with the relevant regulations. Actually, if you think about these bigger companies and like automotive company, they probably, if you just think about their tier 1, tier 2, it already goes to 6,000, 7,000 companies. But then actually these countries and the regulations is even to push further. So if you look at the entire supplier pool, alongside, this supply chain that even can go beyond 50,000 suppliers in total. So with such huge amount of suppliers, how you can really recognize and also how you can manage these compliance and to make sure that they comply with the relevant regulations in the import and export, and meanwhile also that will not create any issues or chaos to your supply chain to keep your cargo moving. That's actually a challenge. Now inside Maersk, we are also working with some digital partners and to actually come up with the solutions. We also have the capabilities to really help our customers to first also identify who are their suppliers alongside their entire production journey. It's not just about the material sourcing or supply. It actually really goes into the first places. So who, for example, if you think about the shoemakers, actually, so it really goes to, okay, who's the rubber, who's provided the rubbers to your manufacturing? This part of intelligence and this part of visibility is exactly what we see. These disruption things and these new regulations is to push the customers to have. If you just think about the U.S. Forced Labor Law Act, it's really demanding on that. For any cargoes and you're sourcing from certain regions, and actually you have to make sure first that you are not on their blacklist. So how you can ensure even not your direct suppliers and not your shippers, how you can ensure the rubber suppliers also not on their blacklist. So actually you need really the technology to help you achieve that. So I think from that part, also I see definitely digital tools and also the new technology will play a more important roles.
Great point. I'm not sure if Jeff is still here from McKinsey, but McKinsey did some surveys a few years ago. They reckoned that I think 40% of COVID-related disruptions were above the second tier in the supply chain, but only 2% of businesses knew anything about the supply chain above the second tier. So hence the need for that information. Exactly.
Okay, it's worked now. Thank you. Also, just want to add an additional comment about the case I just shared, the shoemaker, right? If you think about it, in 2022, actually there's a big flooding happening in Malaysia, hitting the Tanjung Pelepas port, right? So that's happening, as I recall, around November or December. Actually, interesting things. 3 months later, around February, then quite a few our lifestyle customers who are the shoemakers, and they actually sharing with us that their factories suffered from these hiking rubber price because of these floodings in Malaysia 3 months ago. So also you can see that these specific climate change things or these specific disruptions, how these impact actually pass on through this supply chain. So if you are the lifestyles, if you are these big brands of shoemakers, if you think about, okay, if you just look at, who's are your shippers, and also looking at their disruptions, you probably will neglect the rubber part, right? But indeed, it will give you a huge impact in future. And also, this is really affect their cargo readiness. So this actually also push all the customers, all the countries, all the players alongside the supply chain to have a better visibility, not just to know who's your shipper, not just to know who's your consignee, but also really to have the full visibility about who really provided the critical materials alongside the entire supply chain and who actually is contributed in this part.
Our time is almost exhausted, so I introduced technology and digitalization. One other thing we should maybe mention briefly is geopolitics, which obviously is greatly influencing supply chain worldwide and will be affecting this relationship between sustainability and resilience. Coming from the UN, Marianne, do you have a perspective on how geopolitical developments in the world are affecting this interaction between sustainability and resilience?
Thank you. Yes, no, we have lived it with the COVID crisis, with the Ukrainian crisis. No, the war is changing, and we are going more to the integration. No, we are looking because of this, because of the disruption that the geopolitical crisis have affected. We are insisting in promoting the integration, the integration of countries in order to avoid that. And in the maritime sector, as I mentioned in the morning, due to the geopolitics and in the climate change, all the vessels that they have to take a longer way, so they are polluting more, and before they were diminishing the speed, now they have to increase because they have to. So the geopolitical is impacting a lot of the maritime sector. Only I would like to add something about that we have learned a lot, and now we are starting a new project, with UNTAD and ESWA about food security, due to the crisis of food, energy, and finance, all that caused this. We are starting a project in the Arab region with Lebanon and Morocco, and in the Caribbean with Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, in order to help these countries in all the supply chain of the food. So I think we have learned now we are not in the position as we were in 2020, and so we are trying to enhance national actions and to give some policy recommendations, and I see the time's up. Yes. Thank you.
So I think you'll have to report the results of that work in 2 years' time in Saudi Arabia at the next UNCTAD forum, okay? So you're right, our time is exhausted. I mean, I'll maybe take 30 seconds just to wind up this session. A lot of great contributions, so many thanks to the panel for that. Thanks, John, for introducing the social dimension to sustainability, which is very often overlooked. We obsess about climate and emissions, but we need to look at the impact on people as well. Thank you very much, Darwin, for introducing CII. I haven't heard that discussed in any of the other panels, and it's a very important issue, clearly, particularly for this region and elsewhere. So hopefully your pleas will get some response. And thank you very much, Miriam, obviously for talking about the past work you did with COVID and this now future work you're about to do on supply chain resilience. And then thanks, Zira, for the MERS perspective on all of this. A feeling I've often had is that many shippers want to pass the buck, both as far as decarbonisation is concerned and resilience. We'll leave it to the logistics provider to deal with the problem. But at least what you're doing is actually trying to work with your customer base to put together joint resilience strategies. So I think that's very good. So I hope you found that session of interest. Please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of the event.
Oh my God. Oh Oh my God.
If shipping was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter worldwide. Furthermore, 12 to 13% of global sulfur and nitrogen oxides is caused by shipping emissions. And the worst is, maritime transport experiences continuous growth. And without any stringent policy intervention, these emissions are expected to rise further. So what to do to reverse this trend? In July 2023, about a year ago, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, committed to decarbonize international shipping by or around 2050. The IMO policies currently under discussion seek to pull two levers: maximum energy efficiency and a new generation of fuels, the so-called zero-carbon fuels. Based on our analysis at the World Bank, shipping is most likely going to decarbonize thanks to hydrogen, specifically green hydrogen. This includes green hydrogen derivatives, such as green ammonia or green synthetic fuels, like green methanol. These offer a higher energy density than pure hydrogen. This means more energy per unit of space. And as you can imagine, space matters on ships. Eventually, we want to store cargo, not fuel. Let's now move to the second level, the national level, where most of the action needs to take place. And let's ask ourselves, What does this mean for ships and ports in developing countries? With conventional shipping, it was pretty simple. Countries required significant oil reserves to produce shipping fuels like heavy fuel oil. With zero carbon shipping, they will need large renewable energy resources like solar or wind to produce hydrogen and its derivatives. Compared to oil, many more countries around the world, including many developing countries, have these renewable energy resources. So they have a tremendous potential to produce hydrogen-based fuels at low cost, enter competitively a much more inclusive and decentralized fuel market, and become the zero-carbon energy hubs of the future. Let's look at Colombia and Panama, for example. In Colombia, my team at the World Bank focuses on ports along the Caribbean coast, actually not that far away from here. This region, La Guajira in particular, offers some of the world's best renewable energy resources. Some of the target ports, like Puerto Brisa, are currently coal-exporting ports with declining business. We think that these can be converted and upgraded into hydrogen gateways, which can then supply the more energy-constrained Panama Canal, for instance, with green shipping fuels for wider global distribution. Demand for hydrogen-based fuels will not only come from shipping alone, but also from other sectors that need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions too. This relates, for instance, to chemicals, fertilizers, heavy industries, aviation, and potentially trucking as well. And depending on the sector's needs, hydrogen can be used here either as a raw material, as a reduction agent, or simply as a fuel. In South Africa, the World Bank seeks to leverage the country's strategic geographic position at the Cape of Good Hope. We have identified already 2 promising investment cases on the western coast. One of them is the port of Saldanha Bay, and that port offers a double business opportunity in green hydrogen, producing green shipping fuels and at the same time supplying green hydrogen to nearby mothballed iron and steel plant. ArcelorMittal, who is the owner of that mothballed iron and steel plant, has already indicated at what hydrogen price they would be willing to resume operations and bring back jobs to South Africa. In Morocco, the situation is as follows. While the country's south offers the best renewable energy potential, it is the north, with its industrial complex of Jof Lasfar, centered around fertilizer production, and the leading container port Tangimet, which offer the best opportunities for hydrogen consumption and distribution. The challenge now is in Morocco how to ensure cost-effective transport of the hydrogen molecules from the south to the north. And this transport challenge exists all around the world. How do we connect the world's future low-cost production centers for green hydrogen in Latin America, in Africa, the Gulf region, or Oceania, with the world's high-price consumption centers of green hydrogen, which are expected to emerge in Europe and East Asia? Here, pipelines are unrealistic in most cases. Thus, ships and ports, which are able to handle hydrogen-based fuels, will be vital for the development of the global hydrogen economy by linking supply and demand. Major shifts in global energy trade can be expected. Today, hydrogen-based fuels account for only 1% of global energy trading. Here it is mostly methanol. Yet in 2050, these same fuels alone will represent more than 1/5 of global energy trade. So prepare for quite some changes. Eventually, we have arrived at the lowest level, at the local level now, and are wondering, what does this all mean for us here at the forum in this room? This map here gives you an overview of the World Bank's existing and planned country engagements in terms of shipping, ports, and hydrogen. Many more country engagements are in the pipeline. Sometimes at the World Bank, it is the transport department leading them. Sometimes it's the energy department which initiates the engagement. And sometimes it's our private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation. When we think about shipping and ports in the transport department, we think about a multi-sectoral agenda. We always think of three main business cases. The first one is obvious here at the forum. It is about supplying clean fuels for ships. The second one is supplying clean fuels to the local industry. I said iron and steel. I said fertilizer production. And the third one is producing, supplying green fuels for export to Europe, to East Asia. And to seize these business and development cases in these three cases, we obviously need several players to get involved. We need the energy sector to produce the renewable power and ultimately the hydrogen-based fuels. We need the water sector to provide us with the supply of large amounts of desalinated water, as many of these regions that I have mentioned suffer from water constraints. We need the industrial sector to indicate its specific hydrogen needs and to make good use of the hydrogen fuels to decarbonize their own operations. We need the finance sector, both public and private, to mobilize the large-scale investments for wind parks, solar farms, and electrolyzers at gigawatt scale. And ultimately, or maybe most importantly, we need the port sector to bring all these sectors and players together in one central location to enable mutually beneficial trade of this new energy commodity along new, clean global supply chains. For instance, there is a crucial role for port construction, upgrades, or retrofits in many of the countries that I've just mentioned. In South Africa's Buchabai project, the Japanese investor Itocho clearly stated that they would only be willing to make the planned hydrogen and ammonia investments once they can be sure that there will be a port capable of importing large-scale wind power equipment, the blades, the pillars, all the other equipment that you need, and exporting at the same time the green hydrogen-based fuels. So let me quickly summarize once again what we've just sailed across within 10 minutes. First, we've learned that shipping will likely decarbonize thanks to a new generation of fuels, mostly fuels made of green hydrogen. Second, that ships and ports in developing countries will be crucial in advancing the global hydrogen economy worldwide. And third, that ports, specifically port authorities or other port stakeholders, have a unique opportunity to lead or at least co-lead this multi-sectoral hydrogen development agenda. To make all of this happen, my suggestion to you here in the room is we need all hands on deck. So let's bring everybody here at the forum together, the ports, the energy people, the industry people, the finance colleagues, the water colleagues, and let's sort our ship out together. Thank you for your attention. You're not allowed to talk anymore. Okay, I'm going to take over the moderation now.
All right, it works. Oh, Dominic, thank you. Excellent. So, Catherine, you as the maritime lead at the UN High-Level Climate Champion. Now, Dominic talks all the ship that happens, right? But actually, there has been progress, but there's still missing progress. So what's your take on where the sector stand 5 years ago, where are we now, what has already happened, and what are the next steps?
Great, thank you very much for that question. I think there has been significant progress, and a lot of people have already mentioned that over the course of this forum, that the conversations we're having now compared to the conversations we had 5 years ago are very different. And one of the things I would say when you say, what am I really proud of? One of those is that back in 2021, just prior to COP26, the high-level climate champions for COP25 and COP26 launched a campaign called 2030 Breakthroughs. And that actually looked at the system transformation that was needed for the hard-to-abate sectors, including shipping, and tried to quantify what was needed by 2030 in order to be able to achieve net zero by 2050. And for the shipping sector, in partnership with the Global Maritime Forum and University College London, we identified that we needed 5% uptake of zero-emission fuels by 2030 in order to put shipping on course to achieve net zero by 2050. And why is that important and why is this successful is because how the industry got behind that number, how there was so much convergence across voluntary initiatives within the ecosystem, but not only from the industry side and the NGO side, we then had high ambition member states get behind that goal as well. And the fact that that was then adopted in the greenhouse gas strategy last year is something that I think we should all be really proud of, how in a very short period of time, all actors within the ecosystem really converged behind one goal. And then not only did that stay at 5%, that ambition was upped again by the member states, really putting in that striving for 10%. And that's a real example of how we work in the Climate Champions, of really driving that ambition loop between non-state actors and state actors. So I think that's something we should all be really, really proud of. But then when we say what is missing and what is next, what is really critical now, the stage we are at in the negotiations, is that we really do need to ensure that the adoption of the midterm measures incentivizes the uptake of the long-run solutions of green hydrogen and its derivatives. So as Dominic put forward in his presentation, that is really how the shipping industry will decarbonize through the use of green hydrogen and its derivatives. And if we don't incentivize that in these midterm measures when they are adopted next year, then green hydrogen projects are not going to be bankable or investable. So when we need to use the green hydrogen, it's not going to be available. So that's where I think the real focus needs to be in the short term.
I mean, I think that's really interesting because you are actually, we see a lot of black painting what is happening, and you're actually focusing on the positive story behind it, and there is pressure coming up. And we know also that development takes time, and that actually, Sam, takes me to you, because the pressure will also grow on you as a port, and you as a port commissioner for the Port of Seattle, you will definitely feel that pressure. So what are your goals and strategies in order to prepare for that actually we can make these ambitions come true from the port perspective, what Catherine just talked about?
Yeah. Hopefully not all the pressure is on us. Maybe we can transfer that to some of our partners. But as a port, I think we have three main functions when it comes to this transition and catalyzing the investment in energy. One is obviously we are an aggregator of demand. We're a very natural convener of everyone that touches the entire supply chain ecosystem, from truckers to gate operators, whether it's key cranes, heavy-duty trucks, or the carriers themselves, there's really only one entity that touches every aspect of that supply chain, and that is the port. And that's a huge part of the reason why ports have this tremendous pressure to be part of the solution. In addition, I think from an infrastructure standpoint, we are also expected to be the storer, bunkerer, and also distributor of this new energy. Whether or not the hydrogen is being produced locally, I think there is an expectation that ports will be the natural place for these alternative fuels to be distributed globally, whether it's imports or exports. And then lastly, and this really gets at the core of this conversation, is around funding and financing. From the U.S. perspective, we have a historic investment in U.S. infrastructure, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, right? This is over trillions of dollars in investment in our infrastructure that only public entities like a port can apply for, right? And so we need to partner with our private sector, stakeholders to go after that funding to then subsidize the cost of building out cold ironing, onshore power, or bunkering of hydrogen, et cetera. And so I think that's really crucial for that partnership to exist between ports and those private sector stakeholders who need that public subsidy and grants in order to make this economically feasible for the industry overall. I think you're done talking.
Talk anymore?
Oh,
no, I'm back. No, I think that's so important about the hardware that you're talking about, right? Really creating that hardware that this transition can change. That brings me a little bit to you, Namrata, because you work in communication. It's about storytelling, and we just heard two positive stories. But storytelling is also about really changing the culture, how we do things. So what do you think, from your perspective, what can the communication bring into this? How can we bring these stories that are actually real transitions, how can we convert that into powerful messages to transition the sector?
I think it's a great question, and I think I want to flip it slightly, because a lot of people think you do the thing and then you tell the story, right? Like, we have accomplished this, here is a press release, here is a bit of information. But actually, we throw a lot of terms around the room. We talk about accountability, we talk about transparency, we talk about reporting, we talk about stakeholder engagement, we're talking about all of these things. And all of these things are communication. It is us being transparent and engaging with people to get that buy-in, to get these hearts and minds won. So, we're talking about things like getting buy-in from your stakeholders, making sure that water companies as well as bunker suppliers are in the room so that we're not just talking to each other. We do need to get everybody on board. And I think it was Antonio on one of the previous panels, and he said, if we tell the right stories and you get buy-in from multiple stakeholders, even if there's a change in government, you can hold them accountable to the fact that they bought into that idea. And so the concept itself then goes above the players, and it sits as a touch point for everybody to be part of the conversation. And I think when we're talking about stories that we want to tell, obviously, there's a commercial incentive to say things like, oh, this is very difficult, it's a very expensive transition, but also at the same time, we're an industry that has agreed to meet certain targets. We've got Poseidon principles, we've got SDGs that we're trying to achieve, we've got Paris Climate Accords, we've got IMO GHG regulations, we've got multiple touch points that we have to meet. And we want to tell people how we're going to meet these, because if we don't have that, we're not going to have buy-in, but also we're going to replicate each other's work. We're going to waste resources. We're going to say, here is the data system that we're doing here, and somebody else 2 doors down, like one of the other banks, will have something similar. We don't need that. We need to work together. We keep talking about collaboration. How can you collaborate if you don't know what somebody else is doing? So I think the answer is to be very honest and transparent. This does mean taking it in the neck a little bit if you have a failure, but failure is a part of the system. Progress is iterative, right? So if we want to tell the good stories, we have to just be open, and when we achieve something, we share it. When we make a mistake, we don't say, oh no, we made a mistake, we'll never do it again. We say, we made a mistake, let us tell you so that you don't waste the resources, and this is still a positive story.
All right, I think you're making two positive points here. Important points.
Too positive?
No, important, not positive. I think the real issue is, okay, we should walk the talk.
Yeah.
And I think within walking the talk, there will be these positive and negative examples. Now, Catherine, you will hear a lot of what's happening. It's leadership with examples. So maybe you can share some examples, a very positive example, but maybe you can also think of an example where something failed and the lessons learned from that failure really then pushed the boundaries for the next step.
So let's okay. Let's start by leading by example. In the context of this session, about ports, I think we saw the nice map that Dominic presented, where the World Bank is engaging. They're leading examples already, But I think it's what's really interesting about those that are leading by example is that ports are at the centre of these positive examples, and I think because of how Sam's explained the role of the ports and the fact that they're a facilitator and a connector and an enabler of all these different actors within the landscape, the ports are able to lead by example. So we've heard examples from the port of Namibia and the relationship that they have with the port of Antwerp. So we've got this hydrogen and ammonia export terminal being built by the port of Antwerp in the port of Walvis Bay in Namibia over the next 3 to 5 years. And that's a really good example of how, it's going to be state-owned, but it's going to be privately operated. And this gives an example of how the complexities of the port dynamics, so with different actors within one single port. Another good example is the Port of Açu in Brazil. They've got a platform to really accelerate hydrogen from their renewable energy perspective. Again, they've got a big industrial market there. So I think Port of Açu is another real good example. And then we can look at some leading examples like from a government like Panama and their national hydrogen strategy that has really set out ambitious goals, but also put in that 5% of that has to go into, green hydrogen will be bunkered in Panama by 2030. So they have bunkering goals in their hydrogen strategy as well as the production of hydrogen. So some really solid examples that are happening around the world. And I think your question on what maybe hasn't been successful, I would tend to maybe draw a little bit on what Namrata was saying, that these don't tend to be communicated. And I think this is something that we can really learn as an industry. And, I kind of draw parallels, from a safety perspective. We're very good at lessons learned and root causes when something goes wrong. And we share that and we all learn from it. But if I look at parallels within the environmental space, that's not happening. And one of the things that really springs to my mind is green corridors. We've had a proliferation of green corridors. We've now over about 45 consortiums for green corridors since the concept was launched at COP26, which is absolutely brilliant. And you look at the momentum that everyone's got behind this concept. But what's working well and what isn't working well, and how can those corridors that have been around for 3 years share what has worked well and what hasn't worked well, so the emerging corridors today can learn from that? That's something that I think we don't have it. And it was something that I raised a month or so ago at another forum I was speaking at. I was saying, well, why don't we share the lessons learned? Because, like I said, we're so good at it in the safety perspective, but it's not something we do in the environmental space. So going forward, that's something I'd really, really like to see is, the Green Corridor consortiums come together and say, here's our lessons learned, 3 years in.
Can I just add to that
Yeah,
really
sure.
quickly? Sorry. I think there is a reason why people don't talk about it, and it's this notion of wasting resources, right? It's wasting money, wasting time, making a mistake. There's this terror, to be honest, because everybody wants a success story. We're like living Instagram where you only show your best life instead of actually, the bits where you're cooking and scrubbing floors. But we have to cook and scrub floors to look the way we do. We have to make mistakes to get it right. And I think you raised a point, Sam, didn't you, about like 40 million that was spent and you learned a lesson, but it was so useful.
Absolutely. When I first joined the port in 2020, our budget for cold ironing onshore power at one of our terminals was $14 million. I just approved the budget for this same terminal for $38 million. That's how much the price inflation has gotten. That's how much lessons learned, I would argue, there were. And the point I made earlier is that, yes, in business, in corporate world, there is something called the first mover advantage. There is an advantage to being the first. However, there's also something called the second mover advantage. And that is that you've learned all the lessons from the first mover that you don't repeat when you do it later. So why did we go from $14 million to $38 million? What were the lessons learned? And how can we then transmit that intel to our colleagues across the world so that we don't repeat those mistakes again? And I agree with you, as a government entity, we are not rewarded for taking risks. In fact, we are the most risk-adverse entity there is. And for that reason, we're not in the business of flaunting our mistakes, for fear that we would not be able to do it again in any other project or any other way. And so it's a very good point, Catherine. I think whether it's the Green Corridor or even in how we install the infrastructure on a terminal level, that know-how and those lessons learned do need to be distributed throughout the industry.
And I think here we're getting to this very important point about we talk a lot about collaboration, but we still think about this silo. So if it happens to me, I'm not going to share that happened to me. And I think the example you give here very open, Sam, is very important because in the end you have public investment, you have private investment, so we have taxpayers' money, we have private investment. So how do you deal with that? Do you have a specific practice how to attract private investment? Because it's risky investment we want. And we want not to be that risk averse. So what's your take? How do you attract private investment?
So when it comes to private investment, for instance, in the terminal that I was just referring to, it's a cruise ship terminal. And we went to the cruise operators and said, let's co-invest in this. And you really do have to make the argument that this is economical in addition to it being the right thing to do. Right. In the Northwest region, we are blessed with hydrogen power. Right. Our electricity comes from hydro dams. So actually, our price per kilowatt is much lower than, let's say, California. Right. And so it actually makes economical sense for them to plug in as opposed to continue to burn the fuel. Right. And so that's a really easy argument for us to make. Right. And then again, there are ways for us to incentivize cruise lines to get on board. We'll give them a 5 to 10 year lease extension. Maybe we'll give them a better rate on their lease, right? And so there are mechanisms within a landlord-tenant relationship that you can pull when you're negotiating for a co-investment in these things. A couple of other things that I'm seeing in the industry is offtake agreements, and I'm sure we will talk about this a little more later. But offtake agreements are becoming really popular, especially when there's a speculation or uncertainty around the demand for a certain fuel. Right, and so the idea that you can book or claim a future production of certain fuels so that there's no question around whether or not that you will be able to monetize it later is really, really helpful. And then lastly, in the aviation industry, we're seeing a lot of what's called book and claim, right? And so this idea that if you think about a lot of corporate like Microsoft's and Amazon's who have made very aggressive climate reduction, greenhouse gas emission commitments, most of their scope 3 is actually from travel, right? But they don't control the airlines, obviously, right? So they've resorted to actually a book and claim where they basically purchase the carbon credits of production of these fuels that aren't being produced locally. You could have a production facility in Europe that Microsoft purchases those carbon credits ahead of time. Right, and so that's why it's called you book it and then you claim it, and they claim those offsets for their emissions reduction goals. And so those are a couple mechanisms that I'm seeing in industry that are helping kind of finance this transition to clean energy.
Well, thank you. Before I continue with a question to you about Port Authority, Catherine, please, audience, don't be shy. If you have a question, raise your hand, and then we will involve you in our conversation. Dominic, Dominic last.
Yes, there's a man behind you.
Oh, there's a man behind you. So, Catherine, so Sam talked about some initiatives.
The intention is that he'll write it on a piece of paper and send it to us, rather than...
No, he can ask.
Oh, okay.
But I'll ask Catherine first. So, port authorities are quite important in this whole business. So what other recommendations would you have in the role for port authorities? Sam talked about some of the initiatives. Are there other initiatives where you can say, hey, there's a real different role of port authorities? Also considering that we have a lot of time local port authorities, global shipping lines, or we have national port authorities, but in small countries, but global shipping lines to deal with. So it's not always easy in the power relationships as well, but you want to drive the transition. So how can we get the port authorities taking a proactive role in this process?
So the way, how I would say, I'll caveat this with, I've never worked in ports or port authorities, so this is just from...
There's still time, Catherine.
What do you expect? But then just what do you expect from them? What do you expect?
You may have a very different position to how I would say this, but I think, like I said, I think every port is different. Every port has its uniqueness, particularly in its governance structure. And I think that is, that's an opportunity in the sense that, so it's not something to be seen as a negative, but I think we have to value those differences between each port. Some of them that are state-owned, are very different to those that are privately owned, and maybe it's the private ones might be able to move a little bit quicker than the state-owned ones, or vice versa in some circumstances. And then it might be owned by one party, but then operated by another party. Then you've got to consider all the different customers that use the port, and those. So I think, the role of the authority is right at the centre, and we always refer to ports as hubs, and they're at this centre, they're this nexus point where they can really pull together all these different stakeholders that have got an interest within the port. And I think that's something that it's value that just no one else can do, and that's the role of the Port Authority. Has this real ability by sitting at the nexus point, and it's not only how ports can then connect to the local community, the environment, not only their own users, whether they're transport or whether it's industrial users. I think I'd really see that as a strength of the port authorities, and something that even if there's no plan, there's no, it's just to help problem solve. It's helped to come up with a shared vision and shared goal and a shared plans and proposals, and I think that's something that all port authorities have the ability to do, irrespective of their uniqueness and individuality.
I mean, I see Sam smiling and he wants to react. You're really happy with that role, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm laughing because the term Port Authority implies we have authority. And my lawyers are always telling me what we can't do as a Port Authority. Your points are all correct, and I think that our greatest strength is the fact that without us you can't do anything, right? We don't really actually have a lot of regulatory authority. We're not a regulatory agency. It's really tough for us on the enforcement side. But I do think when it comes to collaboration, we are that natural convener, we are the hub, and the reality is that, if you don't work with us, you can't work with us, right? That's our leverage ultimately.
I was going to add really quickly, you brought up a point earlier where you were trying to bake reporting into your lease agreements, right? We have tools, and the intention is not to say, Port Authority, as you said, you are the authority, you're in charge of this. It's to use every single instrument available to you, whether it's regulatory, whether it's financial ESG reporting, whether it's, just getting buy-in from voters for local government. You use every single tool to kind of leverage each other to achieve aims. And as you said, Catherine, you're completely right. Every port is different. Some are controlled by governments, some are landlord ports. But the model fundamentally to say, you have to do this, and it's not us being the bad guys. Look, here's a rule, here's a regulation, here's a principle without which you don't get green finance. That's part of the problem. That's part of the solution, and those things exist. We just don't use them very well to kind of push against each other because we feel like we're competing. But it's actually a way to level the playing field, which is great. And it's what we're always talking about in maritime is leveling the playing field. We should be using it. I know you're waiting, sorry.
I know. Please also give your name and where you're coming from.
My name is Kana Mutombo. I'm from the American Bureau of Shipping. I'm based in Houston. My question is addressed to Dominic from the World Bank. By the way, it was an excellent presentation.
Dominic can talk to you later.
I attended the Port of the Future conference in Houston last month, and there were a lot of ports represented there. And what came out to me was that there's been more and more talk recently that the future of decarbonization is actually nuclear. So what is the World Bank view on that?
There are two, I want to make it super brief. There are two pieces to it. There's my personal opinion, and there's the World Bank opinion. The World Bank opinion is an opinion that doesn't exist yet, that is currently being debated. But that is a request that I'm happily going to forward to Ajay Banga, our president, and he's going to put some pressure on the energy director kind of to solve that issue. It is funny, it was just 2 weeks ago we had Energy Learning Week at the World Bank. Nuclear was on the agenda, and you had, I would say, from what I heard, 50% of the people in favor, 50% of the people being very skeptical. If they had invited me, then it would have been 51% skeptical, because I don't think that it is, there's a reason why nuclear hasn't kind of brought all the benefits that we thought. We still haven't solved the waste problem. We still haven't solved the safety problem. And even if we solve them somehow, just when you look at the pure economics, and I said kind of, this is Dominic Englert's opinion, that there's pure economics, solar and wind is so much cheaper and is expected to become even cheaper in the future with floating solar, with offshore wind and all that stuff, that I don't see any reason why we should go into an energy source where we still haven't solved the fundamental problems yet. However, this is very much digressing from the panel.
I actually want to really quickly give you a little bit of information that I think is relevant. Sorry, I just dived in. Basically, I think we like to look at shipping as a single whole. We know it isn't. We know there's lots of regional divisions. We know there's different types of vessels. We know that some vessels are going to take to solar much better than others. We know some are going to take to methanol or whatever, depending on availability. We know that there are already nuclear-powered ships at sea. We know that other people are exploring them. Core Power is a really good example of a company that's pushing their molten salt reactor. There are different solutions for different things, and I think the point is not to say, how can we move to a single fuel future? That's gone. Like, unless something really changes from all the data that everyone here is talking about, we are looking at a multi-fuel future. And so that's not a case of saying, is nuclear viable? It's under what conditions is nuclear viable, in which routes, on which ships, right? And there are some where it would make sense, in the same way that a battery-powered ship, which most people are like, it's not worth it, is viable for certain ferries that call it reasonable ports, right? Like, I think looking at shipping as a single monolith is false.
I agree, and I think the single biggest point that you touched about is that my understanding of small modular reactors is it's very expensive.
Yeah.
It's cost prohibitive.
Yes.
And to have a nuclear reactor, it's different to have a nuclear reactor to power a city versus a container ship. Right? Just look at it from a cost standpoint. I don't, unless it dramatically falls, I don't see it being economical.
Plus on top of this, sorry, Gordon, 30 seconds. On top of this, yes, there are nuclear-powered ships out there. we are basically talking about Navy ships and a couple of icebreakers, so very, very limited. There's a reason why only the Navy, or mostly the Navy, has it, and only the most powerful navies have it, because they can keep them safe and they can afford them, yeah?
We will talk over coffee. I'm not going to take your time. Go on.
It's going to be a radioactive conversation. Yeah.
I'm down. We'll talk over rum.
All right, so that's going to be interesting. Remember, this conversation is going to take place next to Sustainable Development Goals. But I think the question of the energy sources we are going to use for the future is so interesting. I mean, Dominic mentioned again, and you showed also in your presentation, we have new countries coming in. Now, Sam, what is your take on, will we see a new geography of bunkering? Will the role of the Port of Seattle in the new bunkering world change? Will we see a bunkering hub in Namibia or in Colombia? What is your feel on that?
Yeah, so I do think this changes the physical landscape of ports, right? I think no matter what fuel source we're talking about here, whether it's methanol, hydrogen, ammonia, the density is not the same, which will mean two things. Either ships will get bigger, right, or they will have to refuel more often, right? So I do think this does change the landscape of and the function, whether or not, ships are making more calls to different ports.
I love that you didn't mention carry less cargo. You're like, not an option.
No. Not my choice, not my decision. But I also think that, when I look at the footprint of the ports like Seattle or Long Beach or LA or the major ports in the United States, we're very land constrained, right? Can we even build a bunkering facility in Seattle is a huge question for us. But what I do think is that you don't necessarily need bunkering exactly at the terminals, right? It's a very important point here. In fact, if you go to Port of Busan actually barges their fuel from the Port of Ulsan and refuels ships on the water side. And I do think that that is a model for many ports that might be constrained geographically, where they collaborate with ports in their region. For us, it might be the Port of Everett, which is further north, and they might have the bunkering, and we might barge it down to Seattle and Tacoma to fill the cargo vessels, right? And so I think that is important, that when we talk about bunkering, when we talk about distribution of fuels, it's not necessarily going to be directly on the terminal. We're going to have to create an ecosystem within the region in order to make it work. And you might see multiple ports within a line of shipping routes with bunkering as well, given the nature of these fuels not being as dense as the traditional bunker fuel.
I think that's interesting, because you could say, oh, maybe not it's our rule, it's some other port we need to get strategic involvement with. Catherine, how much is that a worry for you? You talked about the progress of having new vessels coming out. We see the new builds that are coming into the market. How far do you think we will see new locations being part of the bunkering network, or new countries coming part actually of this new energy maritime ecosystem?
So, I mean, we've got existing ports with existing bunkering operations, and for some ports, like the port of Singapore, it's not going to want to lose the fact that they're the #1 bunkering port, but they might not have the land to be able to produce the fuels. But that's like, as Sam said, you look to be able to import that from another location, and then you can still provide the bunkering facilities and the bunkering service. So I think that's not going to, those top bunkering locations are still going to want to be able to remain in the market for providing that service. And then obviously, like we said, that we're seeing that where the fuels are going to be produced are going to have to be transported to the existing bunkering ports. So I mean, it's no different to really what happens now. Not all bunkering locations are where there is an oil refinery that has heavy fuel oil as a waste product that they can just put into the marine market. So it gets shipped around as a product to the locations that it's needed. So I think, you know, that is something that already happens and will continue to happen.
Okay, because I thought there is always this new opportunity or different opportunity for emerging economies to play a different role in this, right? And I think a lot of countries are looking to move up the value chain within this sector. And I think that there is this ambition, okay, I'm producing renewable energy, I also want to create some more added value within my country and maybe be participating in that.
I think... I was going to say that's exactly the case. If for the countries that have got the opportunity to be able to produce green hydrogen or derivatives of, then it's, you know, it can literally just export it all to somewhere else to, you know, or if they do want to start producing having a bunkering service, then that is also a possibility as well. But I think it also depends on whether they've got enough ships calling in to be able to do that, or it just becomes an export thing. But everyone is going to have their own. So there are opportunities, but that will be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting. And I'm coming to you, Namrata. No worries, I'll let you talk.
No, it's all good.
Because you are part of the Alternative Fuel Action Working Group.
Yep. World Climate Action Program. It's called WPCAP.
Yeah. So
it's a great name.
It's a great name. But how far are you supporting different locations being part of the bunkering network? What's your take on that? Or are you going to support the old traditional Singapores, Rotterdams?
Oh, I think that's a false dichotomy. I don't think that's fair. And I think, you know, the point that we made about fuels not being as energy dense, there are, of course, opportunities. But we can't just look at bunkering when we're looking at the future fuel landscapes. There's port of call as well, because you're going to have ships with ammonia calling at your port. If you're a tiny port, there are a whole bunch of safety protocols you're going to really have to think of to make sure that your staff and your marine environment is safe, because you don't really want a bunch of ammonia in the water poisoning your fish and having your local fishing community really upset with you. So the intention is you need all the stakeholders to be working together. There are opportunities for smaller ports, and what we've done is we've put together the port readiness level for marine fuel. So I'm the chair of the working group. There are 13 or 14 ports in the program, and we're about 8 ports in my group. And what we've done is we've taken, you know, the NASA's technology readiness levels, where you kind of go from just coming up with the concept all the way through to making sure your tech is actually market ready and really viable. And we've applied it to ports looking at bunkering, and we've applied it to ports looking at ports of call. And we've got like a hope to do it for ships that will be carrying marine fuels as cargo, which exactly comes to your point, Catherine, of kind of bringing it in so that it can then be distributed from a hub, which distributes to local ports. So you go through 9 levels. You don't have to be level 9. It depends on what your port actually wants, but you will go from doing kind of research through to development all the way through to deployment. And this is a tool, by the way, that is available now. We are testing it right now. We need ports to be working with us. So if you want to test this, please Google it. We're working, it's basically an IAPH and World Port Climate Action Program joint initiative. So if you look at the IAPH website, you can test it. And in October at the World Ports Conference, we're going to be launching the digital version of this tool. It is a self-assessment tool, but there is a lot of help available for it. And basically what we want is everybody to talk to everybody. So it's not a port talking to themselves. It works for all models of ports, whether you're a landlord port or not. And you talk to bunker suppliers, you talk to the shipping lines, you talk to your local government, you talk to your first responders who are going to be tasked with dealing with that. All of them in one thing, and you go through the steps to make sure you have this resilience and you get there. So I think it's a really... I mean, obviously, I'm a comms person, as we keep saying. It's a very important conversation. If we don't talk to each other, how on earth is somebody who's ordering a ship now going to know where their ship can call by 2030, right? Otherwise, we keep talking about stranded assets. We're building it in by saying, oh, it's a competitive advantage, we won't share information. It's ridiculous. We need to talk to each other. Don't share your absolute financial details, but talk about your plans.
Okay, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, we had a very lively conversation. I would really invite Dominic to kind of give a short summary, maybe what we talked about. Good luck. Do you dare to do that?
Okay, I think you want to have a radio-reactive summary. I think the challenge is relatively big. The opportunity is in relative terms even bigger. And whether we see it as a challenge or as an opportunity depends on us, on you, and you, and you, and you, and you. You've heard my opinion about nuclear. You don't know my opinion about hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, biofuels, or whatever. I leave this up to you. Convince me, show to me, even if you want to persuade me that nuclear is the right option, you're totally fine, yeah? Kind of go for it. And I'm more than happy to come back in 2026, where is it, Saudi Arabia or so, where the next one is, and confess here live on stage that I've been wrong, because you've developed the technology and the fuel that has put shipping on a 1.5 aligned decarbonization pathway. Totally fine, I confess here, and I'm going to say kind of you're the master. No, long story short, I'm super, super grateful that we've put together this panel, because it took us quite some time at the World Bank to convince senior management that there is so much potential in ports, to look at them now, to work with them now, to invest in them now, moving forward, a sector that we have, and I openly admit this here, slightly neglected for a couple of years. I would say we are back now. We think that overall decarbonization around the world has put ports and ships back on the agenda, not only of the World Bank, of many, many other players. And it depends on us now what we make out of this opportunity. It also depends on us. I see Roel in one of the last rows, see Aide in one of the first rows. Maybe also Arsenio is hiding somewhere else in the room. He isn't, unfortunately. But let's not let them down. I have trust in them, and obviously in you all, that the IMO is going to provide us with the regulatory framework, stringent policy measures. I'm thinking in particular of a stringent green fuel standard and an ambitious economic measure, carbon pricing, emissions pricing at the IMO. When they provide us with an ambitious policy framework, it is up to us, the World Bank as a financier, Sam as a port authority, Catherine as a winner of the hearts, Gordon from the academia side, and you, Namrata, kind of telling the story right. Not only telling the right story, but telling the story right. It's up to us what we make out of it. I invite everybody really kind of to join forces and to sort our ship out together. Please give a big round of applause to this panel. And we have a small thing for them, because yeah, I know that you've probably hoped for a big grant and so on. Yeah, the World Bank has decided to put all money in shipping decarbonization from now on, so there's no money left for panelists anymore.
The long-term investment.
The long-term investments, but I've got a short-term pleasure instead. At the World Bank, we care about sustainability, and we also...
I'm just going to really quickly add a thing that I forgot to say. By the way, I'm also here as a representative of WISTA International, which encourages more gender diversity in our sector. If you're a woman in the room, please join. If you're a man in the room, please also join, because we want allies. Thank you.
Fantastic, excellent. And regardless of whether you are a woman or man or anything in between or beyond, tomorrow at 4:30, we have another exciting session in this room about policy at the IMO. If you want to learn what is needed in order to help these guys here live on stage, and Arsenio, who is currently joining us, be here at 5:30 again, be at all the other sessions in between, and give another round of applause. And as I said, We want to invest responsibly at the World Bank. We also want to consume responsibly at the World Bank. Usually I would have given a big bottle of rum to each of you now. I didn't want to get you into trouble on your flight. I didn't want to get you into trouble at any night when you may have emptied this with colleagues or friends. So therefore I've gone for the, I would say, the soft version. You get a big package of rum cake, at least, here from the island. Please enjoy, and thank you so much for having been with us. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.